Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Imagine yourself transported to a time long past a world of stone castles, green fields stretching out beneath a heavy sky, and dark forests that seem to whisper with secrets. Picture the cold, hard stone beneath your feet, the faint hum of the wind that moves through the trees, and the distant sound of a horse's hooves. Can you hear it? The sharp echo of swords, the clang of armor, the rhythm of life, slow yet constant. But in this world, there's a story not often told, the life of those who lived by the sword, the ones who wore armor not for ceremony but for survival. You've heard the tales of knights in shining armor, haven't you? The brave heroes, galloping off to battle, saving kingdoms, winning glory, and securing their names in the annals of history. Valor, honor, and victory, these words are synonymous with the knights we all know. But, my friend, the real story, the one often left in the shadows, is far more complex. Today, I invite you to journey with me into this world, not the polished version we often see in songs and stories, but the gritty, uncomfortable reality of a knight's life. For every tale of honor, there was a struggle. For every victory, there was sacrifice. The world of knights was one of constant effort, relentless training, and battles fought in mud and blood. So, picture yourself now. Put aside the romanticized image of the knight. Instead, imagine this. Beneath that polished armor and the grandeur of the castle lies a world fraught with hardships, exhaustion, and a ceaseless fight for survival. Knights were not always the shining heroes of legend. They were warriors bound by a code of duty that often took them far from the comforts of home. Sometimes to lands far away, sometimes facing the very real possibility of death. But what if I told you that waking up before dawn, aching from yesterday's training, and facing endless hours of practice was the routine for these men? Imagine the weight of the sword, not just the gleaming blade, but the pressure of what it represented on a duty and survival. The knights of history didn't simply live for adventure. They endured hardship, both physical and emotional. It wasn't the life of glory they promised you in stories. Now, you may be wondering, how could this be true? After all, knights are supposed to be the epitome of glory. Surely their lives were filled with excitement and victory. But there's a deeper story to be told. A story of a knight's relentless struggle to live up to the expectations placed upon him, a struggle that very few could truly bear. Imagine yourself stepping into this life. The cold, hard floors of a stone castle greet your feet as you rise in the early morning hours. The scent of damp leather and the faint, earthy smell of metal greets you as you buckle your armor. The weight of the armor settles on your shoulders, and you feel the familiar strain. The day has barely begun, but already your body protests. A deep ache in your muscles reminds you of the hours of training, the constant work that has become your life. The clang of swords echoes in the courtyard as you step outside into the chill of the morning air. You've spent years preparing for this, honing your skills with the sword, learning to ride and fight. But now, as the cool light of dawn breaks across the horizon, you wonder, will it be enough? Your hands grip the hilt of the sword, and you feel the weight of it, not just as a weapon but as a symbol of the life you've chosen. It's your tool for survival, yes, but it's also the embodiment of your duty, your obligation to fight for honor, to protect, and to serve. And yet, despite all the preparation, all the years of training, there's an annoying question: will the men around you hold strong when the battle comes? Will your comrades rise to the occasion, or will fear take hold when the first wave of enemies crashes against your ranks? The armor you wear is not just to protect you physically, it's a shield against doubt, against the fear that, this time, maybe, it won't be enough. You've prepared for this, you've trained for this, but the weight of your responsibility weighs on you. The call to battle is not a heroic summons, it's a demand, a burden you must carry. You can't afford to falter. The pressure is constant, the expectation never ends. This is the life of a knight, a life of duty, sacrifice, and a never-ending fight to uphold a code that few could truly live by. As we journey through this story together, we'll uncover the unseen struggles of medieval knights, their long hours, the grueling training, and the toll it took on both body and mind. We'll also step beyond the myths of the knights of old, to look at one of the most famous figures in history, King Arthur. Who was he, really? A mythic hero, a man driven by duty and circumstance. We'll examine the life of Arthur and untangle the truth from the legend. Next, we'll venture into the bloody realities of medieval warfare, what it was really like to face the horrors of battle, the unsanitary conditions, and the tactics that determined the fates of many, from the scent of blood in the air to the brutal aftermath of battle. we'll see the side of warfare that was often left unspoken. Finally, we'll explore the stark contrasts between the knights who fought on the front lines and the nobles who commanded them. What was life like for the lords and ladies who held power and wealth, compared to the knights who served them? The power dynamics of feudal society shaped everything from the knight's sword to the lives of the rich and powerful. The contrast between the two worlds is as stark as it is fascinating. So, let's begin. Imagine yourself now, stepping into the heavy boots of a medieval knight. Close your eyes and let the story unfold. The first light of daybreak slowly creeps through the small window of your quarters, its faint glow just beginning to chase away the darkness of the night. You can feel the coolness in the air, sharp and biting against your exposed skin as you roll out of bed. The straw bedding you've slept on has provided little comfort through the night, its rough texture digging into your body, leaving you with aches that seem to linger, even in the quiet of the early morning. The scent of damp stone fills the air, a constant reminder of the cold, unyielding walls that have become your home. As you move to your feet, your muscles groan in protest, stiff from yesterday's grueling training. The weight of your body feels heavier than it should, an unfortunate reminder of the long hours spent wielding sword and shield, training relentlessly under the watchful eyes of your commanders. Each muscle, from your shoulders to your legs, seems to carry the marks of the day before. But there is no time for rest. There is always more work to do. You stand in the stillness of the morning, listening to the faint sounds that drift through the walls of the castle. The sound of armor being polished in the courtyard, the steady clinking of metal against metal, and the low murmurs of your fellow knights preparing for the day ahead. The rhythm of life as a knight is relentless, and it doesn't stop for you, not even for a moment. The Lord's orders come early. You know that the day ahead will be long, filled with hours of training, drills, and perhaps, depending on the Lord's needs, battle. Your role as a knight is not just to fight in wars, but to be ready for whatever the Lord demands of you. Duty is a constant, ever-present force, and it drives you. You have no choice but to answer, to be ready. Slowly, you gather yourself, the cold air creeping under your tunic as you begin your morning routine. You approach your worn leather armor, the material cracked and faded from years of use. Each piece of armor is a part of you, nor your protection, your identity as a knight. You strap on the leather greaves that protect your shins, the weight of them reminding you that your body is no longer just your own. Your hands, though still stiff from sleep, move with precision as you tighten the straps, adjusting the armor to fit snugly against your form. The creaking of buckles and the sound of metal clinking together fill the silence, almost like a prelude to the day's demands. You take a moment to check your sword, the familiar weight of it as comforting as it is daunting. The blade has been your companion for so long that you could wield it with your eyes closed, but it still requires attention. The edge must be sharp, the hilt tightly bound. Every part of your gear, every inch of armor, must be maintained. For any failure, any slack hood costs you everything. The Lord does not tolerate weakness. You begin stretching, your muscles protesting once again. The long days of combat, training, and duty have worn you down, but you push through. You know what's coming, and you know that you can't afford to fall behind. The rhythm of your life is one of constant preparation. There's no luxury of rest, no time to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. You are a knight, a warrior, and with that title comes responsibility. Responsibility to your Lord, to your fellow knights, and to yourself. You've spent years training for this moment, years perfecting the art of combat, and now, as you stand in the cold, quiet morning light, you wonder how long can you keep this up? How much longer can you endure the physical and emotional toll of a life lived by the sword? But these are thoughts you can't entertain for long. There's no time for The day awaits, and you have a duty to fulfill. You gather your thoughts as you finish preparing. The armor, now fully strapped on, feels heavy against your body, a constant reminder of the role you must play. The weight isn't just physical, it's the burden of expectation. The life of a knight is one of discipline, sacrifice, and above all, survival. You step into the cold courtyard, joining your fellow knights. Their faces are set in the same determined expression, a silent acknowledgement of the grind that awaits them. There's no grand fanfare, no dramatic moments, just the steady hum of daily life. The clatter of weapons, the rhythm of drills, the constant preparation for battles that may never come. Imagine the exhaustion creeping in as you stand with your comrades. You've been through this day after day, yet each time feels like the first. The physical toll is one thing, but it's the emotional exhaustion that wears you down the most. You're not just a warrior, you're a symbol of something much larger. The weight of your armor is nothing compared to the weight of your duty, your honor, Every action is scrutinized. Every move has consequences. As you stand there, waiting for the next command, you feel the familiar tension creeping into your body, the anticipation of what lies ahead, the certainty that there will be no rest, no comfort, just the endless cycle of training, battle, and duty. The world around you might look peaceful, but underneath it all, you know that the grind will continue. And you have no choice but to keep going. In that moment, you realize this is the life you chose. The life of a knight, and whether you're ready or not, the day will unfold, and you'll be called to fulfill your duty. There's no escaping it, no way to stop the march of time. The rhythm of the knight's life is relentless, and it never slows down. Imagine stepping into the courtyard at the break of dawn, your breath visible in the cool morning air. The distant clang of metal against metal echoes across the stone walls. The unmistakable sound of swords striking shields and armor. It's the rhythm of a life devoted to combat, to honor, and to duty. Your body is already weary, aching from the endless hours of training, but there is no rest. The sun has barely risen, yet the courtyard is alive with activity, as fellow knights prepare for another grueling day. And so, you continue, your arms growing heavier with each passing minute, your legs feeling like they might give out beneath you. Your body is tired, your mind is weary, but you can't stop. You must continue. The knight's life is one of endless preparation. There is no end to the training. The battle may be far away, but you must always be ready, always sharp. There is no comfort, no ease in this life. But now, as you stand there, exhausted and unsure, the cracks in the facade begin to show. The knight's life is one of constant duty, and the emotional toll of that duty is as heavy as the sword you wield. You've been trained to fight, to defend, to protect, but in moments like this, it feels like the greatest battle is against yourself, a symbol of chivalry, of the knightly code that dictates every action you take. But that symbol comes at a cost. Every swing of the sword, every exercise, every moment spent in training is not just about preparing your body for battle. The life of a knight is a life of sacrifice, and the sacrifices are often unseen, even by those who benefit from them. They will never know the cost of the life you've chosen, the sacrifices you've made to uphold the knightly code, and it's a cost that only you, as a knight, will ever truly understand. They will never understand the emotional toll of always being expected to be strong, to be brave, to be unwavering, against your own doubts, your own fatigue, your own fear. You want to drop the sword, to lie down, to give in to the exhaustion that has become your constant companion. You've been taught that a knight must embody courage, honor, and strength. To falter now is to dishonor everything you've worked for. To stop is to fail. You are a defender of the weak, a protector of the realm, a paragon of virtue and honor. But what few ever see is the toll this life takes on you. The long hours of training, the endless preparation, the emotional strain, it all comes at the cost of your own peace, your own comfort, your own happiness. And so, you stand tall, sword raised, and you continue. The emotional strain is real, but you will not let it defeat you. Not yet, but you can't. You can't stop. The weight of your role hangs heavy on your shoulders, the pressure to live up to the ideals of knighthood pressing down on you with each passing moment. Only the next drill, the next movement, the next moment of exhaustion. And still, you can't stop. Yet, you press on. This is your life, your duty, and you know that it's not just about fighting. It's about discipline. It's about surviving the grind. The clang of steel against steel rings out as you lift your sword, its weight pulling at your arm. But the knight's code, drilled into you since childhood, tells you otherwise. The weight of responsibility, the weight of expectations. You are a knight, yes, but you are also a symbol of everything that is supposed to be good and just in the world. But beneath that symbolism lies a truth that few will ever understand. The sacrifices you make are often hidden from the world. You can't afford to be weak. You can't afford to fall behind. Your duty to your lord, your comrades, and to yourself demands that you push through. But in this moment, as your sword feels heavier and your limbs refuse to obey, the emotional strain becomes unbearable. The blade feels familiar in your hand, but today, it feels heavier than usual. The physical toll is one thing, the sore muscles, the aching joints, but it's the quiet, insidious weight of your duty that weighs on you now. The relentless pressure to be perfect, to be the ideal knight, begins to chip away at your resolve. You've been taught that a knight must be strong, brave, honorable, and steadfast. You must be the embodiment of all that is noble. But in these quiet moments between drills, When the noise of combat fades and the clamor of swords and shields falls silent, you feel the weight of it all. You've been training for hours spent in the heat of the courtyard, facing opponents who seem to never tire, who never waver. The endless cycle of training, the constant grind, all for a cause that may not even be your own. What if you don't make it? What if, despite all this effort, you fall short? The thought lingers like a shadow, a quiet whisper that you can't shake off. Your arms, once strong and sure, are sore, trembling slightly under the strain of repetition. Each swing, each parry, takes more effort than the last, yet you push forward. Your grip on the hilt of the sword begins to slip, your fingers slick with sweat. It's a slow, agonizing battle won against the growing weariness that threatens to take over your body. The sun rises higher, casting long shadows across the courtyard, and still, you don't stop. You move through the drills. It's a constant reminder of the life you've chosen, the life that has consumed you for so long. The sword you wield is not just a weapon, it is your identity. Every swing of it is a statement. I am a knight, I will not falter. But as you swing again, a thought slips through your mind. What if I can't keep going? What if I'm too tired to fight when the time comes? These thoughts are fleeting, but they are there, haunting the back of your mind. The fear of failure, of weakness, nags at you. You can't afford to let it take hold. The training is relentless. There are no shortcuts, no days off. You've been doing this for years, but the fatigue never goes away. It only grows. Every movement is calculated, deliberate, but it feels as though your body is beginning to betray you. The heat of the sun beats down on you, adding to the weight of your armor, which feels as if it's made of lead. The leather straps rub against your skin, your joints protesting as you move, and still, you can't stop. The noise of combat surrounds you, the sharp clash of metal, the rhythm of your fellow knights moving through their own routines. You must push through. This is what it means to be a knight. There is no room for weakness. You feel the sweat dripping down your face, pooling in your eyes, but there is no time to wipe it away. As the training wears on, the emotional strain begins to set in. You've trained for years, but now, in the midst of your fatigue, you begin to wonder, what is the point? Your body is telling you to stop, to rest, to step away from it all. You've spent so many years honing your skills, training for battle, preparing for a life of honor and glory. There is no rest for the weary, no pause for reflection, and yet, you push through. You have to. You are not just a warrior. You are a symbol. You've been taught that a knight is more than just a soldier. Each swing of the sword is not just a practice of technique. It is a reminder of the weight you carry. Your comrades, your lords, the people you protect, they will never see the hours you spend alone in the quiet of the night. Your body aching, your mind racing with doubt. You are not just a warrior in battle. You are a symbol of something greater. But that symbol comes at a cost. You've been raised on the ideals of knighthood, the unshakable virtues of courage, honor, and duty. From the moment you were old enough to hold a sword, these values were instilled in you, woven into the very fabric of your being. You were told, repeatedly, that a knight was not just a warrior, but a living embodiment of the highest moral standards, an example to the world of what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. You trained long hours, studied the code, and learned that sacrifice was the price of glory. They were the heroes of the songs, the ones whose names were sung around campfires. But the reality is far less glamorous. But now, as you stand in the burning sun, drenched in sweat, the emotional toll of this life weighs heavily on your heart. It's more than just physical exhaustion. There is no room for complacency, no time to rest on your laurels. Every move you make, every action you take, will be scrutinized not just by your fellow knights, but by the people who depend on you for protection, by your lord, and by the world that demands you uphold the highest standards of conduct. As a knight, you cannot afford weakness. There is no respite from this scrutiny, no room for imperfection. From the moment you rise in the morning to the moment you lay down to rest at night, you are always on guard. Your role in society, the responsibility you carry, requires that you remain alert, that you never let your guard down. It starts with the cold, damp air of the early morning, the stillness of the world broken only by the distant sound of roosters crowing. The castle is quiet, but you rise, as you have every day, before the light touches the earth. The castle is a busy place, but so is your body. You cannot afford to waste a moment. The knight's life is one of endless sacrifice, of constant readiness, and of unyielding dedication to the code. Your work is never done. Even as you lie down to sleep, you know that the next day will bring more of the same. The grind never stops. The preparation never ceases. You know that at any time, you may be called upon to defend your lord, to fight for the land, and you must always be ready. There is no comfort in these early hours, no time for leisurely thoughts. After hours of work, you find yourself sparring again, your sword heavy in your hand, your feet sore from hours of running and practice. The knight's life is not a life of leisure, it is a life of constant motion, constant preparation, and constant vigilance. The knight's life is not a life of luxury or leisure, it is a life of constant toil, a life where duty is never far from your mind. It is the rhythm of the world. You've chosen the world of a knight and you live it, day in and day out, without question, without pause. And just when you think the day is over, there is more to be done: maintenance on your armor, planning for the next day's drills, and always the knowledge that you must be prepared for battle at any moment. Your body is stiff from the previous day's training, and the fatigue that clings to you feels like an old friend, always there, always present, even in the quietest moments. When the battle is distant and the castle seems peaceful, you know that you must always be ready for whatever may come. You start by preparing your armor, every strap tightened, every plate checked for dents or scratches. You polish your sword, the blade gleaming as if it had a life of its own. The morning is spent in preparation, not just for the day's duties, but for the endless cycle of training that defines your life. Swordplay, footwork, riding drills, they are all part of the knight's daily grind. There is no day off, no respite from the work that never ends. The stakes are too high. Every moment is a test. Your ability to maintain composure under pressure, to uphold your ideals when faced with danger and fear, will determine whether you are remembered as a true knight or forgotten as another soldier in a long line of forgotten warriors. There is no space for error. It's the mental and emotional weight of living up to a code that demands perfection. Even when you feel like you're at your breaking point, you are a knight, and your vigilance is your greatest weapon. Your reputation is your currency, and one mistake, one moment of hesitation, can destroy everything you've worked for. You may win the battle, but if you fail to uphold the knightly code, if you falter in the face of adversity, your honor will be forever tarnished. The constant weight of this expectation presses down on you, day after day, hour after hour. Can you continue to live up to that ideal? Can you find the strength to rise above your fatigue and push forward? There is no time to second-guess yourself, no room for doubt. Every strike, every move, could be your last. The knights around you move with precision. Their every action a reflection of the years of training that have brought them here. You are part of that rhythm, part of the machine that must function perfectly, without failure. Your performance in battle will define not just the outcome of the fight, but your entire reputation as a knight. The truth is, every knight has these moments of doubt, moments when the grind becomes too much, when the toll on your body and mind threatens to tear you apart. The decision isn't easy, but it's clear. There is no room for doubt. You must keep going. The sword is your companion, and the code is your guide. Yet, there is no choice but to keep going. Your honor, your duty, your very identity are wrapped up in this struggle. To stop, to falter, is to dishonor everything you stand for. You understood that as a knight, your life was not your own. But now, as you stand on the training field, drenched in sweat, muscles aching with fatigue, the weight of those ideals feels heavier than ever. The sun is high, and you have been training for hours yet. There's no relief in sight. You swing your sword again, and it feels like the weight of the world is in your grip. Every movement is slow, deliberate, and painful. Your arms are on fire. Your legs are shaky from the hours of running and sparring. Your body screams for rest, yet you push through. It's what you were taught to do, it's what a knight must do. But in this moment, when exhaustion is gnawing at you, and the sun beats down relentlessly, the ideals of knighthood start to feel like a distant dream. The glory you were promised seems to fade, overshadowed by the reality of your sacrifice. You begin to wonder, can I live up to this code? Can you continue to serve with honor when your body is breaking down? When the weight of your responsibility feels like it's pulling you under? The knights who came before you made it look easy. You were raised to believe that the knight's path is one of unwavering strength, but there is no choice. The life of a knight is one of endless sacrifice, and in this moment, you must choose honor or surrender. The life of a knight is one of constant vigilance. In the heat of battle, your every action will be remembered, every decision recorded in the minds of those who witness it. Imagine yourself standing on the battlefield, sword raised, eyes scanning the horizon for your enemy. The pressure is immense. You are constantly watched by your lord, your comrades, and by the very society that places its faith in you. Every day of your life is a test of your vigilance, your ability to meet the expectations placed upon you. There is no time to relax, no time to let your guard slip. The night's day begins before the sun has even fully risen. Your routine is as unyielding as the night's life itself. After the morning's drills, you often find yourself working in the fields or at the forge, assisting with the preparation of weapons, armor, and supplies. The rest of the day is a continuous cycle of training and service. By nightfall, when the rest of the world has gone to sleep, you are still awake, still preparing. As the moon rises, you finally close your eyes, only to know that when the sun rises again, your routine will begin once more. The air is thick with anticipation, heavy as though the very world is holding its breath. The first light of dawn cuts across the horizon, pale and uncertain, casting long shadows over the field. The enemy is approaching, and you can feel it like a pulse beating in the pit of your stomach, a low, constant thrum that matches the rhythm of your own heartbeat. The air, once cool and calm, now seems stifling, every breath you take more labored than the last. Your breath comes in shallow bursts, as the doubt quietly simmers beneath your ironclad resolve. The air, once thick with tension, is now thick with the roar of war. The heat of battle settles over you like a thick fog, blanketing everything in sweat, blood, and smoke. The thundering sound of hooves and the clashing of swords fill your ears, but there is no time to focus on anything but the next move. The world narrows to the tip of your sword, the shield in your hand, and the opponents in front of you. The fight is long, the outcome uncertain, but there is no time to question it. The battle presses on, and you move through it, your mind blank, your body an instrument of survival. Your mind, once filled with the noble ideals of chivalry, is now empty, absorbed entirely by the brutal necessity of the battle. The sweat pouring down your face, the blood on your armor, the cries of men around you, all of it fades into the background as you focus on the next move, the next threat. It binds you, limits you, but you cannot remove it. You are trapped in it, trapped in this life, and there is no escape. You fight not for glory, but because that is your duty. You fight because it is what you've been trained to do. The knight's life is not a life of triumph, but of survival. The battle will end, and the blood will be washed away, but for now, there is only the fight. You don't think of glory or victory, not anymore. The adrenaline that propelled you into battle starts to dull, and the realization settles in that this isn't about honor. It isn't about glory, it's about survival. Your body moves on instinct, driven by the need to protect, to fight, to survive. The weight of your armor feels like a prison, but you bear it because you have no choice. This is what you were trained for. This is what you were born to do. And in the end, it doesn't matter how the battle turns out. What matters is that you fight until it is over, until there is no more fight left in you. The ideal of knighthood that you've carried for so long starts to fade into the background, overshadowed by the harsh reality of combat. The earth shakes beneath you as the charge is given, the sound of hooves reverberating through the ground, a signal that everything you've prepared for, all your training and fear, has come to this moment. The impact sends a shock up your arm, a brief reminder of the force behind it, but there is no time to dwell. The battlefield is a blur of motion, of clashing swords, of grunts and cries. You don't think of victory or defeat, of winning or losing. You think only of survival, of making it through this moment. Your body is exhausted and your mind is numb, but you can't stop. You can't let down your guard. There is no room for hesitation. There is no space for doubt. Your arms are heavy from the constant motions. Your legs feel like lead beneath you, but you push forward. You feel your breath coming in ragged bursts, your chest constricting with the weight of the air in your lungs. The heat of battle consumes everything around you, blurring the edges of the world. You don't even notice the cuts and bruises until after the battle, when the adrenaline starts to fade, leaving you with nothing but the pain. But that doesn't matter. It's not the pain that drives you. It's the duty. Your body moves without thought, without pause, driven by instincts honed through endless drills. You can feel the weight of the armor, the heat building beneath it, but still, you fight. The blood and sweat mix into the earth beneath your feet, slick and unforgiving. You've been in battles before, but this one feels different. The air is thick with the scent of iron and dust, the battlefield heavy with the cries of combat. There is no room for heroism here, no space for thoughts of personal triumph. You are not fighting for glory. You are fighting to survive. The clash of metal on metal rings out, a sharp, jarring sound that vibrates in your bones. The battlefield before you opens up like a storm, chaos and confusion flooding every inch of space. Will this battle be the one that defines you, or will it be the one that breaks you? The uncertainty lingers as you draw your sword and feel its weight in your hand. Reliable, but so much more than just steel. Your eyes scan the horizon, seeking any sign, any movement that will tell you more of what is coming. You've been preparing for this moment for weeks, for months even, training, day after day, honing your skills to perfection, building yourself up for this very moment. And yet, despite it all, doubt lingers like a shadow at the edges of your thoughts. There is an eerie stillness, a quiet before the storm, but underneath that stillness, the ground seems to hum with energy. You stand shoulder to shoulder with your fellow knights, your armor a second skin, its weight pressing down on you in a way that is both familiar and yet suffocating in this moment. The metal plates and leather straps, which have become an extension of your body, now feel like a chain binding you to this moment, to this purpose. The distant sound of hooves echoes through the air, soft at first but growing louder, thudding with a rhythmic urgency. Will you be enough? Can all the training, all the sacrifices, prepare you for what awaits? You've faced battle before, of course, but this feels different. This is the moment when everything will be tested: your skill, your resolve, your strength. The noise of the enemy's march, the thud of hooves and the creaking of their armor, grows louder still. You steel yourself. The moment is almost here. You cannot afford to falter. The battlefield looms ahead, but here, in the moment before, your mind races, and your body, though trained for this, feels heavy. And then the battle begins. The weight of your sword in your hand grows heavier with every swing. The once familiar balance of your armor now feeling almost suffocating. You swing your sword, feeling the resistance as it meets the enemy's blade. The clanging of swords is relentless. You fight not for yourself, but for those around you, your fellow knights, your lord, your kingdom. You fight to survive. In the midst of the chaos, something begins to shift. Your body moves without thought. Each swing of your sword, each step forward, a mechanical response to the fight at hand. There are no songs to be sung, no banners to wave. Your armor, which once felt like a symbol of your strength, now feels like a cage. You are not thinking of honor. You are not thinking of the future. You are not thinking at all. The battle is over, but its echoes remain. As the last remnants of daylight disappear, the quiet of evening falls over the camp like a heavy blanket. The distant sounds of the battlefield fade into nothingness, replaced by the soft murmur of your fellow knights, the creaking of leather and metal as armor is removed, and the low hum of the river nearby. It is a small comfort, the sound of water rushing over rocks, a constant in a world of endless preparation and conflict. The weight of it lingers, but as the final pieces fall away, there is a small, almost imperceptible sense of relief. What did the battle truly mean? The fire in front of you crackles, the warmth it provides, offering little comfort against the coldness in your chest. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls of your tent, yet the shadows within you seem to stretch farther, darker. As the camp begins to quiet, you can hear the faint chatter of your comrades outside, but you feel removed from it. You stare into the fire, the warmth of the flames doing little to ease, the chill creeping in from the edges of your mind. It is not one of songs sung in your honor, of medals pinned to your chest, of victories celebrated with feasts. It is a life of sacrifice, a life of constant duty, a life lived in the shadow of something greater than yourself. You were raised to be a symbol of virtue, a protector of the weak, a defender of your lord and your kingdom. The cycle will begin anew, and in that there is a certain comfort, a sense of certainty in the chaos. For now, though, you close your eyes. Candlelight flickering across the tense walls, and sleep calls you into the quiet darkness. Another day awaits, but for tonight, you rest. But the truth of it is this: you are a cog in a machine that never stops turning, never rests, never pauses. Your purpose is simple: fight, survive, protect. Your thoughts drift, but always return to the same place. Tomorrow, the drills will start again. Tomorrow, you will rise and do it all over again. The endless repetition of it, or the training, the fighting, the surviving feels like a cycle that never ends. You are surrounded by fellow knights, yes, but the isolation feels palpable, as though the weight of your role as a warrior has distanced you from the rest of the world. What will tomorrow bring? As you sit in your tent, alone with your thoughts, the reality of the knight's life weighs heavily on you. The unrelenting pull of honor, of loyalty, of the code you've sworn to uphold. The knights of legend may be celebrated in stories, but you, the real knight, know the truth. The life you lead is not about glory. It is about sacrifice. There is no room for self-doubt, no room for weakness. But in the quiet, when the sounds of the camp fade and the fire burns low, it's hard not to wonder what it would be like to step away from it all, to find peace, to find a life beyond the sword. Even though you share the same hardships with those around you, even though you fight for the same cause, there is something inherently isolating about the night's existence. You are part of a brotherhood, but that brotherhood is defined by your duty, your sacrifice, your willingness to give everything for a cause that is bigger than you. And yet, in moments like this when the camp is still and the fire burns low, you are left to face the quiet of your own thoughts. These questions, like the tasks of the day, seem endless, as though no matter how much you prepare, there is always something more that remains unanswered. You wonder if there will ever come a day when you are no longer called to battle, when you can lay down your sword and walk away from the constant cycle of conflict and preparation. But as the fire dies down, you know in your heart that there will be no such day not for you. The life of a knight is one of endless service, and though you may long for rest, you know it is a luxury you cannot afford. The world around you is defined by war, and you are just one small part of that. The knight's life is not one of ease. It is one of duty, sacrifice, and uncertainty. There is no glory in this, no triumph to savor. Only the constant grind and never-ending routine that defines every moment of your existence. You move slowly, methodically, checking every strap, ensuring each piece is intact. The satisfaction of completing these necessary tasks is small, but it is there. As the sun sinks lower, the firelight flickers across your camp, its orange glow casting dancing shadows on the canvas walls of your tent. You know you must sleep, but your mind does not rest. It replaying the events of the battle, the faces of those you've lost, the fleeting moments when you thought it was all over. You walk slowly toward your tent, your legs heavy from the strain of the day's efforts. Your body feels every inch of the punishment you've put it through, the grind of battle, the weight of your armor, the constant tension in your shoulders. Your armor, battered and stained, must be cleaned and oiled to prepare for the next fight. Your sword, now dull from the clash of metal, must be sharpened. The horses must be fed, the supplies accounted for, the next day's drills prepared. There is no real end, no moment where you can truly let go. You take a deep breath, steeling yourself for the duties that remain. The day may be over, but the knight's life is one of ceaseless motion, of unending preparation. Every movement feels slow, deliberate, as if your body is reminding you of the toll it has taken. You're grimy, caked in dust, sweat, and the remnants of battle. The familiar smell of iron and earth lingers, a permanent mark of the day's violence. But as you approach the camp, the frantic pace of battle gives way to a momentary peace, a brief, fleeting silence that can almost fool you into thinking the day is done. Yet, the work isn't finished. There is always more to do. You drop your sword to the ground and, with a grunt, remove your armor piece by piece. There are questions in your mind, but no answers. You sit down in your tent, the sounds of the camp outside fading to a dull murmur. There is a strange loneliness that comes with this life, an unspoken truth that lingers in the background. You wonder if it will ever end. The quiet in your tent amplifies the distance you feel. It is a silence that is both calming and suffocating. The knight's life is not one of glory. And yet, even with the certainty of your role, there are moments like this, when the exhaustion and the isolation of it all become too much to ignore. But that is not your life. Your life is defined by service. And in the end, that is what keeps you going. Tomorrow, you will rise again, just as you always do. King Arthur stands as one of the most enduring and captivating figures in Western culture. Over the centuries, his story has been retold, reinterpreted, and immortalized in countless forms of art, literature, and folklore. From medieval texts to modern-day films, the name Arthur conjures images of a world where valor, chivalry, and destiny intertwine. As the once and future king, his narrative has always transcended the bounds of any single era. His story continues to evolve, shaped by the concerns, values, and hopes of those who retell it. This vision, encapsulated in the myth of Camelot, serves as a mirror to our own desires for fairness, justice, and a leader who embodies the highest ideals of humanity. The line between myth and history is often difficult to distinguish in Arthur's case, as his legend is wrapped in layers of folklore, fantastical embellishments, and poetic license. Was Arthur a real historical figure, a king who once ruled Britain and fought to defend it from invading forces, whose ill-immorted Arthur in 1485 cemented the most popular elements of the Arthurian myth, the Knights of the Round Table, the quest for the Holy Grail, and Arthur's tragic downfall. Arthur's legend likely emerged from a mixture of real events and folk memory, compounded by the desire for a figure who could unite the fractured kingdom of post-Roman Britain. While no definitive proof of Arthur's historical existence has been uncovered, the lack of evidence does not diminish the impact of the legend. The knightly ideals embodied in Arthur's character, honor, duty, loyalty, and justice are timeless virtues, universally cherished and aspired to in all societies. In his stories, the pursuit of honor is paramount, and it transcends personal glory. Arthur, like all great heroes, must give of himself for the greater good, and his sacrifice is not just one of battle but of personal cost. His tragic fate, brought about by betrayal and internal division, serves as a reminder that the pursuit of an ideal world often comes with profound personal loss. This theme of sacrifice is relatable and deeply human, which makes Arthur's story so universally poignant. It is in the very nature of his legend an ideal that transcends history, a dream that never dies, that King Arthur will remain forever the archetype of the righteous king, the noble knight, and the enduring hope of a better tomorrow. His downfall, though tragic, is part of the human condition. No ideal can last forever, and no kingdom remains untouched by failure. Arthur's knights of the Round Table, for example, are often depicted not merely as warriors, but as men on a quest to uphold moral righteousness. This pursuit of honor, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, makes the Arthurian legend particularly compelling to modern audiences. From the earliest medieval romances to contemporary interpretations in films such as Excalibur and King Arthur, the legend's themes are adaptable and continuously relevant. Whether in the historical context of the Middle Ages or the modern world, Arthur remains a symbol of the eternal struggle for a better, fairer world. In a world that often feels chaotic and fragmented, the desire for a figure like Arthur, one who remains steadfast, committed to justice, and above all noble, offers solace and inspiration. These ideals are not confined to any single culture or time period but transcend history, giving Arthur's legend a universal resonance. His story has evolved into a powerful symbol of ideal kingship and the moral and social virtues that leadership demands. The idea of Camelot, a kingdom where honor reigns and justice prevails, offers a glimpse into what a better world might look like. It reminds us of what we might strive for: ideas of leadership, community, and mutual respect that can unite people in the face of chaos. Even though Arthur's kingdom ultimately falls, the dream of Camelot remains alive, carried forward in the hopes of every generation. Over time, these tales were embellished, passed down through oral traditions, and shaped by the moral and social values of each era. The ambiguity of his existence may be what gives the Arthurian myth its staying power. The legend provides a narrative that can adapt to the changing needs and ideals of each generation, allowing the figure of Arthur to remain relevant and meaningful, even when the history of his life cannot be pinned down. As such, Arthur has come to symbolize a much larger, idealized vision of kingship than what history could ever provide. Or was he simply a literary creation, born from the needs of a fractured society in search of a unifying symbol? In Arthur we see the image of a king who, even as he stumbles and falls, represents hope for a better world. And it is this enduring hope, this aspiration for the ideal, that keeps Arthur alive in the public consciousness. His cultural significance goes beyond the confines of a single narrative or historical event. His image transcends the specifics of medieval life, becoming a symbol for all times. The reasons for his widespread appeal are manifold, but perhaps chief among them is the purity of his ideals: courage in battle, justice in governance, loyalty to friends and allies, and an unwavering sense of duty. These virtues, while rooted in the medieval chivalric code, resonate with timeless relevance and provide an aspirational blueprint for leadership and morality. Early accounts of Arthur, like those found in the Welsh Historia Britannica, describe him as a military leader, a warlord who fought against the Saxon invasions during the Dark Ages of Britain, but these references are scant, and they do not present a definitive portrait of a king. The first truly detailed account of Arthur comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, written in the 12th century, which introduces Arthur not just as a warrior, but as a near-divine figure destined to unite Britain. However, Geoffrey's narrative is highly imaginative, mixing historical events with legend, and cannot be relied upon as historical fact. He is not merely a king but a symbol of ideal leadership, the embodiment of nobility and courage, and the archetypal hero fighting for the good of his people. Arthur, as a king, is consistently portrayed as the noble ruler fighting against the forces of darkness, chaos, and injustice. This ongoing struggle, whether against external enemies or internal divisions, has inspired countless stories, films, and even political rhetoric over the centuries. His legend is filled with moments of grandeur, where his decisions, made with wisdom and strength, save his kingdom. But just as often, his reign reveals the frailties and challenges that come with leadership, making him a human hero rather than a flawless demigod. His character embodies the complexities of leadership, showing that true greatness often lies not in perfection, but in perseverance, responsibility, and sacrifice. Arthur's cultural significance extends far beyond the borders of Britain, where his story is said to have originated. His tale has been embraced by countless cultures, inspiring generations to come. The ideals of King Arthur are woven into the fabric of the Western imagination, shaping the very definition of kingship and heroism. Throughout centuries of political turbulence, Arthur's reign in the mythic Camelot has been seen as a golden age, a brief period where justice and peace flourished under the rule of a wise and just king. The legend of King Arthur embodies the eternal quest for righteousness, not just in his time, but for all generations to follow. Arthur represents more than just an iconic figure. He is a complex symbol of the balance between power and responsibility, glory and sacrifice. At the heart of King Arthur's legend lies the quintessential battle of good versus evil. Through Arthur, we also encounter a central, universal theme: the promise of a just world, a world that can only be achieved through struggle, unity, and moral fortitude. While King Arthur's legend is so deeply ingrained in the cultural fabric of the Western world, his true historical existence remains one of the greatest mysteries of all time. The truth is, the existence of King Arthur as a specific historical figure is debatable. The stories surrounding Arthur grew in scope over the centuries, especially in the hands of medieval poets and writers like Sir Thomas Malory. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, many scholars continue to debate whether there was a real Arthur, perhaps a local leader, a warrior chieftain, or even a Romano-British figure who fought against the Saxons. Thus, King Arthur occupies a space between myth and reality, with his legend offering a story of timeless heroism, even if the historical foundations are uncertain. The enduring appeal of King Arthur can be attributed to a number of factors, all tied to the universal qualities and values he represents. At the heart of Arthur's enduring legacy is the idea of honor. Another reason Arthur's legend endures is the concept of sacrifice. Perhaps most important of all, Arthur's story endures because of the hope it represents. Through literature, film, and popular culture, King Arthur's story continues to evolve, and, in a world that often feels fractured, his story will continue to endure. King Arthur's birth is shrouded in both mystery and magic, embodying the very essence of heroism and destiny. It is not merely the arrival of a child into the world, but a moment that will change the course of history. His birth is a pivotal event that transcends ordinary circumstances, steeped in legend, fate, and the intervention of powerful forces. To understand Arthur's origins is to understand the core of the medieval conception of kingship. The idea that a ruler is often chosen by forces beyond the mortal realm. Arthur was born under extraordinary circumstances, a child of magic and intrigue. He was not simply the heir to a throne, he was a child of fate, chosen and destined for greatness. Without Merlin, there would be no Arthur as we know him. It is Merlin who ensures that Arthur's birth does not lead to his demise, who protects the future king and guides him toward greatness. But Merlin is more than just a mentor. He is a pivotal figure whose influence over Arthur shapes the very essence of the King Arthur will become. Merlin becomes Arthur's spiritual and intellectual guide, ensuring that the young king is raised not as a boy but as a future ruler. Merlin's foresight and magic are instrumental in making Arthur the king he was destined to be. As the rightful heir to the throne of Britain, Arthur could easily have been raised among the luxuries and dangers of a royal life. However, Merlin foresaw that the boy's survival depended on being hidden away from the political intrigues and treacherous schemes that swirled around Uther's death. It emphasizes that Arthur's greatness was not inherent from birth, but something he would have to earn. Raised away from the royal court, Arthur was free from the corrupting influence of power, privilege, and the often treacherous dynamics of court life. His upbringing in a modest household gave him the opportunity to develop not only physical strength, but also moral integrity. As he learned the ways of knighthood alongside Sir Kay, Arthur developed qualities that would later define him as a just and noble king. As the wise, magical figure who can see the future, Merlin shapes not only Arthur's destiny but the entire kingdom of Britain. The idea that a king could rise from humble beginnings to wield ultimate power reflects a deep-seated belief in the value of merit, virtue, and personal responsibility. While Arthur may have been born into royalty, it was his actions and character, not just his bloodline, that ultimately made him a king worthy of the throne. In this theme, the idea that destiny is shaped not by birth alone, but by the choices a person makes resonates deeply with audiences, both medieval and modern. The king is not left to flounder on his own. He has Merlin's wisdom to draw upon, a bond that will remain central to Arthur's story throughout his life. Arthur was hidden away from the world until the time was right, until he was ready to fulfill his role as the ruler of Britain. He would have the strength, humility, and character to lead his people without the arrogance and privilege often associated with royalty. His secret upbringing taught him the value of service over station, humility over pride, and sacrifice over self-interest, all qualities that would become the bedrock of his rule. This sense of timing, of fate waiting to reveal its true purpose, was central to Arthurian legend. The world was not ready for him yet, but when the time came, Arthur would emerge as the king Britain desperately needed. In Arthur's birth, medieval listeners would have seen not only the miraculous power of Merlin. His power is derived from his understanding of the natural world, his knowledge of magic, and his connection to the divine. Yet, for all his wisdom, Merlin's advice often comes at a high cost. He teaches Arthur the importance of ruling justly and honorably, but he also reminds him that true kingship comes with profound sacrifices. As a mentor, Merlin ensures that Arthur's path to kingship is not an easy one, but one that will ultimately shape Arthur into the ideal ruler. But also the deep symbolism of a kingdom and a people saved by forces beyond their understanding. Arthur's story embodies the notion that, in times of great need, a hero will emerge, a king who is not just human but touched by something greater. Sir Ector's family became Arthur's surrogate family, and it was here that Arthur was raised alongside Sir Ector's son, Sir Kay. Although Arthur was unaware of his true heritage for much of his childhood, this period of secrecy was crucial in shaping him into the man who would one day rule. His father, Uther Pendragon, the King of Britain, was struck by an overwhelming love for Igraine, the wife of the Duke of Cornwall. But this was no ordinary love affair, this was the stuff of legends. When Uther Pendragon dies, leaving Britain vulnerable, Merlin recognizes that Arthur is the rightful heir to the throne. However, Merlin also understands the dangers that lie in Arthur's royal bloodline enemies, who would kill the infant prince to secure their own positions of power. To protect Arthur from these threats, Merlin arranges for the child to be raised in secrecy, far away from the turmoil of the court, in the care of Sir Ector, a nobleman loyal to Uther. Uther, unable to win Igraine's affections in a natural way, turned to the wizard Merlin for help. He also serves as a moral and intellectual guide. From a young age, Arthur is shaped not only by his bloodline but by Merlin's wisdom. Merlin imparts to Arthur the values that will shape his reign on: justice, bravery, and the necessity of making hard decisions for the good of the realm. These lessons are woven into the very fabric of Arthur's character, ensuring that when the time comes for him to take the throne, he will not just be a king in name, but a ruler who embodies the virtues of knighthood and leadership. In one of his most iconic feats, Merlin used his sorcery to disguise Uther as Igraine's husband, allowing him to seduce her without her knowledge. The result of this magical union was a child conceived not just through passion but through the manipulation of fate itself. From the moment of his conception, Arthur was marked as a figure of prophecy. His birth was not simply a continuation of the Pendragon bloodline, but the product of a supernatural act, setting the stage for a destiny unlike any other. Much like the Greek hero Perseus, who was born under miraculous circumstances involving the gods, or the biblical story of Jesus Christ, whose birth was heralded by divine prophecy, Arthur's birth is not the beginning of an ordinary life, but the start of something extraordinary. These kinds of heroic births were common in myth, representing the idea that heroes are chosen from birth, often through divine will, to fulfill a greater purpose. Arthur's birth, conceived through Merlin's magic, symbolized the idea that greatness and destiny were intertwined with the very fabric of his being. For medieval audiences, this birth was profoundly significant. It was the very essence of kingship, a ruler not born through mere chance, but through divine intervention. His conception and birth were signs that Arthur was destined for something great. He was not just a child but the fulfillment of a prophecy. His life was to be one of epic significance, a life marked by destiny. This magical conception, in many ways, mirrors the births of other legendary heroes across cultures. The magical and almost divine nature of his conceptions set Arthur apart from ordinary kings. Merlin, the mystical sage and wise advisor, stands at the heart of Arthur's origins and his early development. Merlin's role as a guide and protector begins shortly after Arthur's birth, but Merlin's involvement with Arthur goes beyond mere protection. Merlin's role is also one of prophecy. He knows that Arthur is destined to be king, and this knowledge fills Merlin with both hope and responsibility. Merlin's wisdom, however, is not without its complexity. One of the most poignant and symbolic aspects of Arthur's early life is his secret upbringing, away from the royal court. Thus, Arthur was taken from his royal birthplace and placed in the care of Sir Ector, a loyal nobleman, who lived in the countryside, far from the capital. The secrecy surrounding Arthur's early life has powerful symbolic meaning. In many ways, Arthur's hidden origins reflect the idea that greatness often emerges from unexpected places. Furthermore, the secrecy of Arthur's upbringing ties into the larger narrative of prophecy and destiny. In keeping Arthur's true identity hidden, Merlin ensured that Arthur would be both an outsider and an insider. The moment when Arthur pulls the sword from the stone is one of the most iconic scenes in Western mythology, embodying the mystical and prophetic qualities that have come to define his story. In most versions of the Arthurian legend, the sword, known as Excalibur, in later retellings, is imbued with magical significance. It is not simply a weapon, it is a symbol of authority and destiny. The sword was placed in the stone by Merlin, or at his behest, and it was foretold that only the true King of Britain could pull it free. This act was not merely an impressive feat of strength, it was a test of divine right, and it was in this moment that Arthur's destiny was revealed to all. He is accepting a responsibility laid upon him by fate and the gods. This idea of divine selection is central to his reign and defines the very nature of his kingship. Arthur is, in the eyes of his people, not just the king because he was born into royalty, but because he was chosen for something greater, a ruler whose authority is validated by something more powerful than mere human politics. At the time, Arthur was just a boy unaware of his royal lineage, raised in the household of Sir Ector, living a life of simplicity and modesty. The political climate was one of tension and suspicion, with various lords vying for power. The golden age of Camelot was born from Arthur's unyielding commitment to uniting his kingdom and establishing a society where justice and honor were paramount, and it represents his connection to the supernatural forces that guide his destiny. While the sword in the stone moment is significant in affirming Arthur's legitimacy as king, it is a weapon, but also a tool of leadership. Its blade is meant to defend, protect, and maintain order. In Norse mythology, the swordgram, wielded by the hero Sigurd, shares similarities with Excalibur. It is not merely an external tool, it is an extension of Arthur himself. Throughout his reign, Excalibur serves as a reminder of his divine right to rule, and it is through the sword that Arthur is most fully realized as the hero and king destined for greatness. It is his weapon in the literal and metaphorical sense, providing him not only with the means to protect his kingdom, but the moral strength to face the challenges of leadership. Both swords are not simply weapons, they are symbols of destiny, power, and the hero's ability to overcome great odds. Similarly, in Japanese mythology, the sword Kusanagi no Tsurugi holds great spiritual significance as a symbol of the divine right to rule. Like Excalibur, Kusanagi is not just a sword, but a manifestation of power, divinity, and the ruler's sacred duty. Throughout Arthur's reign, Excalibur becomes a powerful emblem of his role as protector of the kingdom, and its role is central to the many battles he fights to defend Britain from internal and external threats. Excalibur itself takes on a deeper, more symbolic role in Arthur's life and reign. The sword is not just a weapon, it is the materialization of Arthur's divine mission, his connection to the gods, and his responsibility to ensure the peace and security of Britain. As long as he possesses Excalibur, Arthur's kingdom is safe from destruction, at least until the moment when fate decides it is time for his rule to end. The sword's eventual return to the Lady of the Lake at the end of Arthur's reign, and the symbolic act of throwing it into the water, signifies the conclusion of his destiny. Excalibur, like the king himself, is tied to the natural order, and when Arthur's time has passed, so too must the sword be returned to the mystical realm from which it came. His early struggles, his ability to unite the people, and his strategic leadership all paved the way for the establishment of Camelot, a symbol of hope and unity in a fragmented world. Yet Arthur's ability to navigate these challenges and create a sense of unity and loyalty among the fractured factions of Britain set the foundation for his legendary reign. Following the fall of the Roman Empire in Britain, the country was plunged into chaos. This gift is not given lightly. It is a mark of Arthur's status as the chosen king. Excalibur is said to be indestructible, capable of cutting through anything, even the most formidable of enemies. Its magical properties serve as a reminder that Arthur is not merely a mortal king, but one chosen by the divine to protect and rule over Britain. The sword's magical qualities also connect Arthur to the ancient and supernatural forces that govern his fate. The Lady of the Lake, as the giver of Excalibur, further emphasizes the divine support Arthur enjoys in his journey. The first task of the new king was to solidify his authority over a divided land. Through diplomacy, military prowess, and personal charisma, he sought to forge alliances with local lords, winning their loyalty through acts of wisdom and justice. His military campaigns, although necessary to secure his kingdom, were also reflective of his desire to unite the Britons under a single banner, ensuring that the country would not fall into further chaos or disarray. Unlike the kings of neighboring lands whose power was established through the force of arms or family connections, Arthur had to build trust, loyalty, and respect from a kingdom that had long been divided by political factions and internal struggles. Various warlords and local lords fought for power, and the Saxons and other invading forces continually threatened the stability of the land. Britain had become a fractured state, vulnerable to external invasion and internal conflict. His strength in battle was matched only by his ability to rule with fairness and wisdom. His decisions, whether in matters of diplomacy or warfare, were guided by a deep sense of responsibility to the people of Britain, and through his actions, he earned the trust and admiration of his people. The challenge of pulling the sword was meant to reveal the rightful king, not through birthright alone but through divine selection. The fact that Arthur, a humble and unassuming youth, was the one to succeed where all others had failed, immediately transformed him into the center of the kingdom's attention. Unlike many monarchs who inherit their thrones through inheritance or force, Arthur is not chosen by human will but by fate itself. His rise is not solely due to political maneuvering or the natural succession of bloodlines, but because of a cosmic or divine plan. The sword's resistance to being pulled by anyone other than Arthur signifies that kingship is not something to be claimed. It is a responsibility given to those whom fate deems worthy. The importance of this theme in medieval Europe cannot be overstated, as it reflected the ideals of chivalry and the sanctity of the monarch's role in both governing and defending the kingdom. His true identity was revealed to all. He was the son of Uther Pendragon, the rightful heir to the throne. This test of kingship reflects the medieval belief in the divine right of kings, the idea that a ruler's authority comes not from popular consent or political maneuvering, but from God or divine fate. In Arthur's case, the sword was not just a weapon of war. It was a sign of God's will, a physical manifestation of the divine mandate to rule. For the medieval audience, Arthur's rise to power, marked by the symbolic act of drawing the sword, was a reaffirmation of the idea that true kings are chosen by a higher power, and that kingship itself is a sacred duty. The sword in the stone is also significant in how it sets Arthur apart from other rulers in the legend. Thus, when Arthur draws the sword from the stone, he is not simply claiming a throne. After the dramatic moment of pulling the sword from the stone, Arthur's true challenge begins, uniting Britain, a kingdom torn by strife and division. In this environment, Arthur's rise to power is seen as both a blessing and a necessity. Arthur's early reign was defined by his efforts to unite not only his subjects but also the various kingdoms and factions of Britain. In these early years, Arthur proved himself to be not just a warrior, but a leader capable of bringing disparate factions together. But uniting Britain was no small feat. Arthur faced opposition from rival claimants to the throne, some of whom sought to undermine his rule and challenge his legitimacy. In time, Arthur's military victories, coupled with his just and noble rule, led to the flourishing of Camelot, a kingdom that became a beacon of peace, prosperity, and the ideals of chivalry. Excalibur is far more than a mere sword. It is a symbol of Arthur's divine right to rule. The sword is first given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake, a mystical figure who embodies the power of the magical realm. Excalibur is symbolic not only of Arthur's kingship, but of the sacred trust placed upon him to govern justly. When compared to other mythic swords, Excalibur holds a special place. What makes Excalibur unique, however, is its deep connection to Arthur's identity. The sword's indestructibility, coupled with its magical properties, underscores the idea that Arthur's reign is protected by supernatural forces. The creation of the Round Table stands as one of the most powerful and idealistic symbols of Arthurian legend. It represents not only a physical object in Arthur's court, but an embodiment of his vision for a just and harmonious society. By positioning the table as a circular, rather than a rectangular, structure, Arthur ensured that no knight could claim a position of greater significance or superiority. Kings reigned at the top, and below them lay a hierarchy of lords, knights, and serfs. Power was divvied up through lineage, wealth, and military might, with little room for the equality of the people. In the rigid hierarchies of most monarchies, kings were seen as the sole decision. Below them were the lords, who wielded military and economic power, and beneath them, knights who served both militarily and as administrators of the king's will. His legendary status as the greatest knight of the Round Table is undisputed, as his feats in battle and devotion to Arthur's ideals earned him reverence across the kingdom. Lancelot is depicted as the embodiment of the knightly virtues bravery, loyalty, and skill. However, it is precisely these virtues that lead to his downfall. His story complicates the otherwise idealistic vision of Camelot, adding depth and moral complexity to the legend. Known for his unwavering commitment to honor and truth, Gawain represents the ideal knight who strives to uphold the values of his order, even at great personal cost. His role in the Green Knight story is particularly significant, as it explores the inner moral conflict of a knight, who is both bound by his oath and subject to the imperfections of human nature. Through Lancelot, we see that honor and loyalty, though central to the chivalric code, are not always sufficient to shield a man from the consequences of his actions. In such a system, the king's word was law, and there was little room for negotiation or egalitarian ideals. Galahad's purity, both physical and spiritual, makes him the ideal knight, one whose virtuous qualities allow him to achieve what others could not. The Grail, a symbol of divine grace and enlightenment, is not just a physical object, but a spiritual goal that represents the highest aspirations of the knights. The Round Table, by contrast, erased those barriers, allowing for a form of leadership grounded in fairness and mutual respect. The Holy Grail quest is an allegorical representation of the knightly path, a search for meaning beyond the material world. The challenge of the Green Knight, where Gawain must strike him with an axe, and then receive a return blow a year later. It was a time when knights embodied the highest ideals of chivalry, where the kingdom flourished in peace and prosperity. The peace and prosperity that flourished under Arthur's reign were the direct result of the commitment to these ideals, and Camelot became a shining beacon of hope for all who sought a better world. In the eyes of the people, Camelot was not just a kingdom, it was a vision of the perfect society. A society in which the highest moral principles were put into practice. Even as the kingdom eventually crumbled, the legacy of the Golden Age lived on, inspiring future generations to strive for a society governed by justice, equality, and honor. The ideals of Camelot continue to resonate today, serving as a timeless reminder that the pursuit of virtue and righteousness can guide us toward a better world. The Golden Age of Camelot was marked by a society where justice was upheld, where loyalty to the king, while other periods in history have experienced times of peace. Few were marked by the same idealistic vision of unity, justice, and honor that defined Arthur's reign. Camelot's Golden Age may have been short, but it stands as a model for what society could achieve when guided by noble ideals, and a commitment to the common good, and to each other was sacred, and where the pursuit of truth and honor was the ultimate goal. His decisions, whether in battle or governance, were made with an eye toward the greater good of his people and the kingdom. Arthur was a king who led not with fear but with love for his people, and his reign represented the possibility of a just society governed by moral virtue. He was not a king who ruled from a distance, but one who was actively involved in the challenges and decisions of his court. His leadership was defined by a constant balancing act between his role as a king and his duties as a knight who had sworn to uphold justice, protect the helpless, and defend the realm from evil. As king, Arthur did not see himself as a ruler whose power was absolute or unquestioned. Instead, he embraced the idea of governance through wisdom, consensus, and the collective responsibility of his knights. This was reflected in the structure of the Round Table, where decisions were made as a group, and each knight's voice carried equal weight. His journey to fulfill the terms of the challenge is a test not just of physical courage but of moral strength. Percival, in his early years, is depicted as naive and innocent, but as his journey progresses, he matures and learns the true meaning of nobility and sacrifice. His quest for the Grail is symbolic of the quest for spiritual enlightenment. and it highlights the importance of purity and devotion in the search for divine truth. Ultimately, Gawain's failure to fully uphold his vow, when he accepts the magical girdle to protect himself from harm, highlights the tension between the ideal of perfect knighthood and the reality of human imperfection. It was Arthur's radical and progressive vision that sought to break down these barriers, creating a court where decisions were made collectively and with an equal voice given to all, regardless of birth or social standing. His journey reflects the challenges that Arthur himself faces as a king, and Gawain's internal struggle for honor mirrors the external struggles Arthur faces in ruling Britain. His story adds a layer of depth to the concept of chivalry, showing that even the most virtuous knights are flawed and must grapple with the complexities of duty, honor, and self. The Round Table, on the other hand, was a progressive idea in an attempt to create a governance system where the rule of law and moral authority transcended birthright and privilege. These knights heroes of their time, with virtues both noble and human, were bound, not only by their oaths to protect the kingdom, but by the chivalric code that defined their existence. Among these knights, a few stand out as the central figures of Arthurian legend. What began as a deep and abiding love between the two became the ultimate betrayal. Lancelot's love for Guinevere, though genuine, is a violation of the sacred vows of loyalty and service that knights swore to uphold. His affair causes a rift between him and Arthur, leading to the eventual breakdown of the Round Table. The tension between love and duty, loyalty and betrayal, makes Lancelot's character both heroic and tragic. He is the quintessential tragic hero who seeks redemption, but is never fully able to reconcile his actions with the ideals he has sworn to uphold. These knights' journeys marked by quests, battles, and internal struggles are what ultimately defined the rise and fall of Camelot. Unlike other royal courts, where the king was the undisputed ruler with ultimate authority, the Round Table represented a shift toward a more collaborative approach, where each knight's contribution was valued equally. The lack of a head of the table often symbolized as the seat of power in medieval courts meant that every knight seated around it was regarded as an equal in status, entitled to an equal voice in matters of the realm. This was not just an aesthetic choice but a deep philosophical statement. In Arthur's court, power was not concentrated in one figure, but shared among the knights who had sworn to protect the kingdom. The Round Table, therefore, was not just a seat for the Council of Knights, but a mirror of the collaborative and egalitarian approach Arthur had for his rule. In a time when feudal monarchies were defined by rigid hierarchies and divisions of power, the Round Table was a radical departure from these traditional structures. At its heart, the Round Table was a symbol of equality. In an age when kings often ruled with an iron fist, Arthur's decision to convene a table where all knights could contribute was a manifestation of his belief in justice, wisdom, and collective action. It reflects Arthur's character, a ruler who did not seek to dominate but to lead through shared ideals. The Round Table was not only a space for it was a symbol of a perfect society that valued the well-being of all its members, no matter their rank. This was an extraordinary vision for its time. Medieval society was, for the most part, built on a rigid feudal system. This idealism was deeply influential, inspiring future notions of leadership, governance, and justice. By contrasting the Round Table with other medieval courts, we can see just how groundbreaking Arthur's ideals were. While the Round Table was a symbol of equality and unity, it was the knights who sat around it who truly brought Arthur's vision to life. Perhaps the most famous and complex of Arthur's knights is Sir Lancelot. Lancelot's affair with Queen Guinevere, Arthur's wife, is the tragic heart of his story. Lancelot's affair with Guinevere serves as a reminder that even the noblest of knights are susceptible to human flaws. Sir Gawain is another of the key knights whose story serves to exemplify the chivalric ideals of Arthurian legend. The tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the most well-known and deeply moral stories in Arthurian legend. Gawain's story is a profound commentary on the difficulties of living up to the highest ideals of the chivalric code. Sir Percival and Sir Galahad are two knights whose quests for the Holy Grail symbolize the spiritual journey of the Knights of the Round Table. Often depicted as the perfect knight is the one who ultimately succeeds in finding the Holy Grail, completing the quest that had eluded so many other knights. The stories of Percival and Galahad underscore the spiritual dimension of the knights' quests, showing that their journeys were not just about physical battles, but about inner transformation and the pursuit of higher truth. Arthur's leadership was not only defined by his military victories, but by his commitment to justice, fairness, and collaboration. Arthur's leadership style was deeply rooted in the chivalric code, a set of principles that emphasized honor, service, and loyalty. Arthur's ideal of kingship was, at its core, a moral vision, a vision where the ruler's strength came not from his ability to command, but from his ability to lead by example. Camelot, under Arthur's rule, represented the pinnacle of what could be achieved in a just and honorable society. In this idealized version of Britain, the Knights of the Round Table became the exemplars of what it meant to live a virtuous life. Comparing Camelot's golden age to other historical periods of peace, we see that Arthur's reign, though idealized, represents an aspiration for a just and harmonious society. Through the Round Table, the knights, and Arthur's leadership, Camelot represented a fleeting but profound vision of what a perfect society could look like. Camelot, the once glorious kingdom founded on ideals of honor, justice, and unity, did not crumble due to external invasion or warfare but from within. The roots of its destruction were sown early on, as the very foundation of its unity began to crack under the weight of betrayal, human imperfection, and the complexity of relationships that defined the knights and their king. It represented a moral and emotional betrayal that shattered the unity of Camelot, the Round Table, and Arthur's sense of personal honor. Here was a king who had united a fractured land, who had established a court of nobility and respect, only to have it all unravel because of the frailties of the people closest to him. It was a reminder that even in the most virtuous of kingdoms, human flaws cannot be avoided. Camelot was slowly losing its moral foundation, and its collapse was only a matter of time. The love between Lancelot and Guinevere, while genuine on both sides, carried with it the very seeds of destruction. His inability to attain the sacred relic was not due to any lack of physical strength or courage. The Knights of Camelot, though bound by honor, were still men, subject to flaws, desires, and limitations. Arthur's own dream of a perfect society, represented by the quest for the Grail, was never fully realized. The Knights of Camelot, despite their noble vows, could not escape their own human weaknesses. As the Grail quest proved, no one, no matter how virtuous, could ever truly attain perfection. It is not merely a battle between father and son. It is a symbolic confrontation between the ideals of Camelot and the human forces that seek to tear it apart. As Arthur faces Mordred in battle, he understands that this is the end of everything he has fought for. It is a battle that cannot be won, not because of the physical might of Mordred, but because of the internal division that has irreparably weakened the kingdom. The betrayal of his own blood, the ultimate act of treason, marks the final, inevitable collapse of Camelot. But the passing of an era time when Camelot's ideals of honor, justice, and unity were possible, despite the corruption, betrayal, and moral decay that led to its fall. The legend of Camelot remains a powerful reminder of the potential for greatness in human society, and the eternal struggle between idealism and reality. And the very ideals that defined Camelot were constantly undermined by the imperfections of its leaders. From Lancelot and Guinevere's affair to Mordred's rebellion, the kingdom's unraveling reflects the inherent flaws in both its leadership and the ideals upon which it was founded. Arthur's death marks the symbolic end of Camelot's dream, but his legacy, though marked by tragedy, lives on in the hearts of those who remember the ideals he fought for. The fall of Camelot serves as both a warning and an enduring symbol of the complexities of human nature and the challenges of striving for a perfect world. As Arthur lies dying, he reflects on the fall of Camelot and the disintegration of the ideals he had worked so tirelessly to uphold. His last moments are filled with sorrow not just for his own death, but for the death of Camelot itself. The kingdom that had once represented justice, peace, and unity now lies in ruin, torn apart by internal strife, betrayal, and human weakness. But rather to the emotional and moral burden that he carried his guilt over the affair with Guinevere. His last command, given to is the symbolic act of returning Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake. But this is a hope rooted more in myth and longing than in reality. Arthur's death marks the end of Camelot, not just as a kingdom, but as an idea. The dream of a perfect society, governed by the highest ideals of chivalry, has ended, leaving behind only the memory of what could have been. The fall of Camelot is both tragic and inevitable, a reminder of the fleeting nature of utopian ideals and the inevitability of human imperfection. This act signifies the end of his reign and the end of Camelot's dream. The sword, once a symbol of his divine right to rule, is returned to the mystical forces that gave it to him. The act is as much about Arthur's recognition that his time has come to an end, as it is about the passing of the ideals of Camelot. Excalibur's return to the lake represents the end of the chivalric era and the closing of the chapter on a kingdom that, despite its imperfections, once sought to embody the highest ideals of leadership and justice. It was not simply a failure of the knights. It was a reflection of the fallibility of Camelot itself. Raised in secrecy and bitterness, Mordred harbored resentment for the king who had denied him his rightful place. His presence in the kingdom was not just a threat to Arthur's reign, but also to the very ideals upon which Camelot was founded. The inability to attain the Grail signaled the spiritual failure of the Round Table, and, by extension, the kingdom Arthur had built. His betrayal was not just a personal act of vengeance. Mordred sought to seize the throne from Arthur, driven by ambition and the desire for power. But Mordred was more than a mere traitor. He was a symbol of the collapse of the ideals of justice and unity that Camelot once embodied. His very existence challenged the moral vision Arthur had worked so hard to create. Camelot's quest for perfection, for a utopia governed by chivalric virtue, was always doomed to fail because of the inherent flaws of human nature. Lancelot, despite being the most renowned of the knights, was haunted by his own imperfections, and it was these flaws that rendered him spiritually unworthy of the Grail. The failure of Lancelot, the knight who had seemed closest to the ideal, exposed the limitations of even the greatest knights of the Round Table. It was a stark reminder that chivalric virtue is not just about external feats, but is deeply tied to inner integrity and purity of purpose. This sacred relic, said to possess divine power, symbolized purity, redemption, and spiritual enlightenment. The knights who embarked on the Grail quest were tested not only by physical trials, but by their internal struggles. The Grail was a symbol of divine grace, and only those who were pure in heart and spirit could hope to attain it. It was a reminder that honor was not just about outward bravery and loyalty, but also about inner purity and moral rectitude. It was a spiritual test of the knight's honor, loyalty, and worthiness to serve the higher ideals that Camelot had been founded upon. The love affair highlighted the inherent conflict between personal desires and public duty. Lancelot, a man of incredible skill and bravery, was not immune to this tension, and his moral failings symbolized the very human nature that Arthur had hoped to transcend through his ideals. Lancelot, the knight whom Arthur trusted more than any other, had transgressed the very bond that tied him to Arthur, not merely as a knight, but as a close companion and friend. The affair with Guinevere was the manifestation of personal weakness, the inability of even the most honorable men to live up to the perfect code of chivalry and virtue that they were sworn to uphold. At the heart of this decay was the illicit affair between the kingdom's greatest and most beloved knight, and Queen Guinevere, Arthur's own wife. Lancelot and Guinevere's affair was not just a personal transgression. It was a catastrophic breach of the ideals that Arthur had worked so hard to uphold. For Arthur, the emotional toll of this betrayal was unimaginable. The affair not only destroyed the trust between Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere, but it also created deep divisions within the Round Table. The knights, once united by their shared code of honor, began to question the validity of the ideals that they had sworn to uphold. The image of Camelot as an unassailable utopia, founded on perfect knights and a just king, began to erode. Camelot, as an ideal, was shattered because its human founders were flawed, just like the very people they swore to protect. Even the most virtuous were susceptible to the temptations of the heart, and once that temptation entered, there was no escaping the consequences. The affair between Lancelot and Guinevere was not merely a personal betrayal. It was symbolic of the corruption that begins at the heart of any great society. In an attempt to salvage the ideals of Camelot, Arthur initiated one of the most sacred and noble quests in the Arthurian legend, the search for the Holy Grail. However, proved to be a mirror of Camelot itself, a reflection of its greatness and its deep flaws. Sir Lancelot, despite his unmatched bravery and skill, was unable to achieve the Grail. Moreover, the failure of the Grail quest also highlights a deeper, more tragic theme: the inherent human limitation that prevents even the noblest of men from achieving the divine. The Grail quest, thus, became not just a test of courage but a profound commentary on the limits of human potential and the difficulty of living up to an ideal. The seeds of Camelot's destruction, sown in betrayal and imperfection, would finally come to fruition with the arrival of Mordred, Arthur's illegitimate son. Mordred's rebellion was the culmination of everything that had gone wrong with Camelot. The final battle between Arthur and Mordred is one of the most tragic moments in the Arthurian saga. Arthur's mortal wounding in the final battle with Mordred signifies the end of both his life and the kingdom he fought so hard to build. Yet, even in his death, Arthur's legacy endures. As Arthur dies, there is still a glimmer of hope in the legend that one day, the once and future king will return to restore Britain. In his final moments, Arthur's death is not just the passing of a king. This detailed exploration of the fall of Camelot and the tragedy of Arthur delves into the profound moral and emotional struggles that led to the collapse of the kingdom. The legend of King Arthur stands as one of the most iconic and enduring narratives in the history of Western literature and mythology. From the earliest medieval texts to the most recent cinematic portrayals, Arthur's image as the ideal king noble. Arthur is portrayed not only as a king but as a beacon of the ideal ruler, one who sacrifices personal desires for the good of the kingdom, who rules with wisdom, fairness, and justice, and who, despite his own flaws, strives to embody the highest ideals of humanity. The Arthurian legend has been reimagined countless times, influencing everything from medieval chivalric orders to modern political leaders. His eventual downfall, marked by betrayal and the internal collapse of Camelot, serves as a warning that even the most virtuous rulers must grapple with the flaws inherent in human nature. The ideal king must, ultimately, reconcile the dream of a perfect world with the reality of the challenges and imperfections of leadership. This tension between aspiration and reality continues to make Arthur's story relevant, and the Mabinogion, both of which mention Arthur as a warrior who defended Britain from invaders. These sources, while valuable, provide little concrete information about his life and reign, and often present him more as a legendary figure than a historical one. The Annal Cambria, for example, mentions a battle at Badon Hill, where Arthur is said to have led the Britons to victory, but it provides no further details about his life or kingship. It is not merely the triumphs of his reign that speak to us today, but also the tragic elements of his story. Why has it continued to captivate audiences for over 1,000 years, inspiring literature, film, television, and countless His vision of Camelot, with its round table of knights sworn to uphold the highest moral code, was an attempt to build a utopian society. His rise to power is marked by a sense of destiny, but it is the tragic flaws and betrayals within Camelot that lead to its downfall. From the medieval tales of La Morte d'Arthur to modern reinterpretations in novels, films, and television shows, Arthur's myth continues to evolve. The myth of the once and future king remains a powerful symbol of hope that one day, a leader who embodies the highest ideals will rise again to restore balance and justice. Whether as a historical figure, a mythic hero, or an enduring symbol of leadership, his legacy will continue to live on in the collective imagination. Arthur is, and will always be, a timeless figure, a beacon of what leadership can aspire to be, and a reminder of the challenges that come with the pursuit of greatness. His story is not just one of kings and knights, but of the eternal struggle for a better world, an ideal that remains just out of reach, yet endlessly worth pursuing. Even as Camelot's fall represents the collapse of an idealized kingdom, Arthur's story reminds us that such ideals, though difficult to attain, are worth striving for. His story has been reshaped to fit the needs and values of each new generation, but the core elements, his quest for a just society, his tragic flaws, and the eventual collapse of Camelot remain unchanged. The myth of King Arthur speaks not just to the ideals of kingship but to the universal themes of human imperfection and the eternal conflict between ambition and fate. Even as Camelot's fall represents the tragic end of a perfect vision, Arthur's legacy lives on as a symbol of hope and a model of leadership that continues to resonate with each new generation. Arthur is a figure who transcends his historical or mythical origins to become a symbol of the eternal struggle for a better world, a symbol of the complexities of leadership and the burdens of power. This story of moral ambition, failure, and the fragility of even the greatest of societies speaks to the complexities of the human condition. Arthur's character embodies both the greatness and the vulnerability of leadership, making his story universally relatable. Leaders, whether political or spiritual, are often burdened by the weight of their responsibilities, and Arthur's tale serves as a cautionary reminder of the fragility of idealism in the face of human imperfection. Though that society ultimately fell to betrayal, corruption, and internal strife, the dream of Camelot, the ideal of a just, noble society, Arthur's struggled to create that world, and the personal sacrifices he made in the pursuit of these ideals resonates deeply in the human psyche. The answer lies in the universal themes embedded within the Arthurian legend, the themes of leadership, justice, loyalty, betrayal, and the inevitable decline that comes with even the most virtuous of rulers. Some scholars propose that Arthur could have been a military leader or chieftain in post-Roman Britain, possibly leading a group of Celtic Britons against the Saxons during the 5th or 6th centuries. Some scholars believe that Arthur could have been inspired by figures such as a British king mentioned in historical texts who fought in Gaul against the Saxons in the late 5th century. Whether based in historical fact or entirely a creation of myth, Arthur's legacy endures because it speaks to universal human themes of leadership, honor, justice, and the complexity of moral choices. Arthur's mythic journey from his rise to kingship to his tragic fall continues to serve as a powerful narrative that reflects both the aspirations and the limitations of the human experience. But the growing body of literature and legend surrounding Arthur expanded his role far beyond that of a single man, and he gradually became an amalgamation of different leaders, warriors, and mythic heroes. As the stories of Arthur were passed down through generations, his image evolved, and he became not just a historical figure, but a mythic archetype of the perfect king, a leader whose virtues transcended time. However, the lack of definitive historical documentation makes it difficult to separate fact from fiction, which serve as a reminder that even the noblest of leaders are vulnerable to the weaknesses of those around them and to their own failings. The imagery of Arthur, the noble king who seeks the betterment of his people, the valiant knight who never falters in his devotion. Two justices inspired political figures and activists who have invoked his ideals as a guide to moral leadership. Geoffrey's work, though one of the first to present a detailed narrative of Arthur's life, was not a historical account, but a romanticized version of events that blended myth, legend, and some factual elements. Geoffrey's Arthur was depicted as a heroic king who united Britain and fought off invaders, but the story is woven with fantastical elements, such as the appearance of Merlin, the wizard, and the magical sword, Excalibur. While Geoffrey's account is foundational to the Arthurian legend, it is not historically precise, and much of what he wrote is seen as embedded. Even in the 21st century, Arthur's story remains a powerful symbol of what leadership can and should strive to be, one marked by courage, selflessness, and an unwavering commitment to the greater good. His leadership was not founded on brute strength or coercion, but on the values of virtue and morality. He is the ruler who leads not with an iron fist, but with a guiding hand that protects and nurtures his people. The debate over Arthur's historical authenticity has been a subject of scholarly discussion for centuries. Some historians argue that Arthur was a historical figure, perhaps a warlord or a regional leader in the post-Roman period of Britain, while others maintain that he is entirely a mythical creation, forged by poets and storytellers. These virtues, often idealized in literature and art, have made Arthur a symbol of the kind of ruler that society hopes to see in times of political and moral crisis, and unwavering in his quest to create a perfect society. His reign, the foundation of Camelot, represented an attempt to build a society rooted in chivalric ideals, a society where honor, justice, and loyalty were paramount. The Round Table, a symbol of equality and fairness, stands at the center of this vision. Unlike other medieval monarchs, which were often characterized by rigid hierarchies and political maneuvering, Arthur's Round Table represented an ideal of equality, where each knight, regardless of his birth or station, had an equal voice in matters of the kingdom. It was a radical vision for its time, one that championed not just personal glory, but collective responsibility, mutual respect, and the shared pursuit of justice. Even now, centuries after the first tales were told, the image of King Arthur resonates as a model of leadership, heroism, and chivalric virtue. At its core, Arthurian legend speaks to the timeless qualities that we admire in leadership: honor, wisdom, and a deep sense of duty. But Arthur's greatness is not limited to his rule alone. This ideal of leadership transcends Arthur's time and continues to shape modern ideas of kingship and governance. Arthur's idealism, however, does not come without a price. Despite the powerful symbolism and idealism associated with Arthur, there remains a profound historical question. Was Arthur a real person, or is he purely a myth? The earliest references to Arthur can be found in texts like Geoffrey of Monmouth, Es Historia Regum Britannia, written in the 12th century. In addition to Geoffrey, other early references to Arthur appear in the Welsh tradition, such as in the Annal Cambria. While these references hint at a real figure who may have inspired the Arthurian legend, there is little evidence to suggest that Arthur was a historical king in the traditional sense. Other theories suggest that Arthur's legend may have been influenced by multiple historical figures who were later blended into a single narrative. The question of whether Arthur was a real person may never be definitively answered, but what remains clear is that his story has had a profound impact on both history and culture. What makes Arthur's story so enduring? At its core, Arthur's story represents a quest for a better world, one founded on ideals of equality, justice, and honor. Arthur's enduring appeal is also connected to the archetype he represents: the hero who rises to meet great challenges, only to be undone by forces beyond his control. The ongoing fascination with Arthur in modern culture is a testament to the timelessness of his story. In today's world, Arthur's legacy continues to influence leaders, artists, and thinkers alike. In this sense, King Arthur will never truly die. This extended exploration of Arthur's enduring legacy delves deeper into how Arthur's story continues to shape our understanding of leadership, chivalry, and heroism, as well as the ongoing debate about his historical truth. Medieval warfare cannot be understood without first grasping the structure of the feudal system that dominated much of Europe during the Middle Ages. The term feudal refers to a hierarchical social and political structure in which land was exchanged for loyalty, military service, and labor. This land, however, came with obligations. Vassals were required to provide military service when called upon by their lord. Similarly, lords would call upon their own vassals to muster armies for warfare, often in defense of the realm, or to claim new territories. A lord would provide a knight with land or other rewards, and in return, the knight would offer military service. When a conflict arose, it was up to the lord to gather his vassals, raise an army, and lead it into battle. The size of the army and the resources it could muster were directly tied to the lord's wealth and influence. Lords had the responsibility to protect their lands, defend their honor, and assert their power through military might. This meant that warfare was often seasonal, with long, laborious months spent encamped in hostile territories, waiting for opportunities to strike, while disease and hunger frequently took their toll on soldiers. The after-effects of battle could be more painful and dangerous than the fight itself, with disease and lack of resources claiming more lives than combat ever would. These long campaigns drained resources, not just from the soldiers but from the local population as well, as the need for food, supplies, and horses was often critical. For the knights, the cost of loyalty to their lords was often more than just physical. Many knights had to sacrifice their personal time, their families, and their financial well-being to fight for the lord who held dominion over them. And disillusioned with the endless campaigns, especially as they witnessed the futility of constant warfare. While the concept of honor was central to their identity, knights also grappled with the inherent contradictions of their lives. The disparity between the noble ideals of chivalry and the often brutal, violent reality of the battlefield. This tension between ideals and reality could lead to feelings of exhaustion, disillusionment, and even guilt for those who lived by the code, but could not reconcile the pain of war with the ideals they had sworn to uphold. Furthermore, knights were bound by the chivalric code, which required them to demonstrate unwavering loyalty, bravery, and honor, often leading them to make great personal sacrifices in pursuit of these ideals. While knights and lords might have seen themselves as warriors bound by duty and honor, the common folk who were called upon to fight often bore the greater cost, losing husbands, fathers, and sons to the violence of feudal warfare. The ripple effect of each battle, each conflict, reverberated through society, and the personal sacrifices of both the knights and common soldiers shaped the very fabric of medieval life. With the land around a battlefield ravaged by warfare, peasants and farmers were left with little to sustain their livelihoods, further deepening the cycle of hardship that fed the war machine. Many knights and soldiers would march miles each day in heavy armor, across rough terrain, enduring hardships that went beyond the violence of the battlefield. They often had little choice but to fight, driven by fear, coercion, or the need to survive. Their experiences were marked by hardship, and, while knights enjoyed the benefits of their noble status, the common soldier was often left to endure the harshest conditions, from hunger and disease to the constant threat of death. The lives of these soldiers were expendable, with many sent to the front lines of battle or tasked with dangerous and thankless duties in siege warfare, all without the rewards and recognition that knights received. Knights were the core of medieval armies, often serving as mounted cavalry who could engage in shock combat during battles. While kings could try to exert control over the nobility, the feudal system meant that these noble families maintained significant autonomy. While knights were often celebrated for their valor and skill in combat, battle outcomes were never guaranteed. Even the most well-prepared armies could be defeated by unexpected weather, poor logistics, or the strategic brilliance of an opposing general. The loss of a key battle could lead to years of rebuilding and recovery, as armies and kingdoms fought to regain lost territory. Moreover, medieval battles often lacked the clear-cut victories we associate with modern warfare. Many battles were simply drawn-out clashes of attrition, where the forces fought until one side eventually gave in, not because they had decisively won, but because they had simply run out of resources or morale. These drawn-out conflicts not only sapped the physical strength of the soldiers, but also their psychological resolve. This decentralization meant that wars were often fought not just for territorial expansion, but also for the maintenance of personal power, fealty, and reputation. Whether a knight was defending his lord's lands, asserting his own claims to fiefdoms, or simply fighting to gain prestige, the nature of warfare in the medieval period was deeply intertwined with the personal relationships between knights and their lords. They wore armor that was costly and heavy, often requiring not just physical strength, but also a level of financial independence to maintain. One of the most important aspects of medieval warfare was its grueling and prolonged nature. Unlike the modern concept of quick, decisive battles, medieval warfare was often a drawn-out affair, involving not just battles but sieges, raids, and other prolonged military campaigns. These campaigns were often exhausting, and could last for months, or even years. Soldiers were expected to travel vast distances, living off the land or whatever provisions they could scavenge, which added an immense physical and psychological toll on both knights and foot soldiers. These knights, usually coming from the noble class, were not just fighters, but were also bound by the chivalric coda set of ideals that emphasized loyalty, bravery, and the defense of the helpless. This decentralized system, where each noble had their own soldiers and was responsible for maintaining order and protection within their fief, meant that medieval warfare was highly localized and fragmented. In a world fragmented by constant warfare, kings, lords, and knights relied on the bonds of fealty to maintain power and defend territories, rather than centralized, large-scale battles. The feudal system meant that warfare often occurred in smaller skirmishes and sieges, each one a microcosm of the broader struggles for power and control. The king or monarch, who theoretically held dominion over all land, could call on his vassals to fight for the kingdom, but it was the lords and knights who controlled the armies and made the decisions on the ground. This decentralized power structure had significant implications for the way wars were waged, for the ability to raise and sustain armies, and for the duration of these conflicts. At the heart of the feudal system was the concept of vassalage, where a lesser noble or swore allegiance to a higher lord in exchange for land, known as a fief, as elite soldiers bound by an oath of service to their lord. Knights were heavily armored and trained to fight with swords, lances, and other weapons of war. But despite their reputation for bravery and skill, knights were not independent actors in the feudal system. They were vassals, and their role in battle was to fulfill the military obligations they had sworn to their lord. This decentralized approach to warfare often led to prolonged and localized conflicts. Knights were at the center of medieval warfare. The loyalty between knights and lords was foundational to feudal society. Lords, who were typically wealthy landowners, played a dual role in warfare. They were both commanders and sources of resources. In practice, this often meant that knights and lords were constantly engaged in the ebb and flow of regional conflicts. Feudal warfare was marked by a variety of factors that made it unique compared to later periods of war. Campaigns could start in the spring and stretch through the summer and fall, with each army moving and fighting in various locations until the weather turned cold, signaling a temporary halt to battle until the next year. Once a battle or siege had ended, the wounded were often left untreated or given only rudimentary medical care, which led to prolonged suffering or death. The uncertainty of victory was another core reality of medieval warfare. The personal sacrifices involved in feudal warfare were significant, and the emotional and mental toll was also immense. Knights who fought in numerous battles over the course of their lives could easily become weary. For the foot soldiers and peasants who fought for their lords, the sacrifices were even more dire. The impact of these sacrifices was felt not only by the soldiers themselves, but also by their families and communities. Medieval battles were complex, multifaceted events, with each soldier playing a unique and critical role in the larger strategy. The composition of armies during this time was diverse, ranging from heavily armored knights to poorly equipped foot soldiers, and from the emerging importance of archers and crossbowmen to the elite cavalry. The hierarchy within these armies was often defined by social status and military specialization. which greatly influenced their roles in battle. While knights may have been the elite fighters, it was the foot soldiers who made up the bulk of the army. They often fought in tight formations, such as the shield wall, to present a unified defense against enemy charges. In many ways, their importance cannot be understated, as they often engaged in combat long before the cavalry had a chance to make their decisive moves. The longbow, in particular, proved to be one of the most devastating weapons on the medieval battlefield. English longbowmen, such as those at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, demonstrated the power of ranged units to shift the balance of power in battle. Though slower to reload and less powerful than the longbow, crossbows could deliver heavy, bolt-like projectiles with great precision, making them especially deadly against armored knights. However, crossbowmen required training to use effectively, and the time needed to reload a crossbow made them less mobile than archers. The longbow had a far greater range than most melee weapons and could shoot arrows with incredible force, piercing even the armor of knights. Their role grew in importance as new tactics involving ranged combat became integral to military strategy. Due to their relatively low social status, foot soldiers often faced the harshest conditions of war living in rough conditions, with poor rations and little protection beyond basic armor or padded tunics. The long double-edged blade was used in combination with a shield, which offered additional defense and allowed knights to fight at close range. The bow's importance continued into the late Middle Ages, until the advent of gunpowder weaponry, which eventually overshadowed it. Unlike battlefield combat, siege warfare was prolonged and involved different types of mechanical devices designed to break down walls, gates, and other defenses. Key siege weapons included trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers. The ACS, with its heavy, cleaving blade, could easily chop through the armor of enemy soldiers, while the mace, a blunt weapon, was designed to crush through helmets and shields. These siege engines could launch projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over long distances, causing significant damage to castle walls. The outcome of a siege often depended on the durability of the defenses and the ingenuity of the attackers in overcoming them. While it was a strong defensive measure, it required excellent discipline and coordination to maintain, as even a small breach could lead to disastrous consequences. Battering rams were used to break down gates or doors, often swung by soldiers in a coordinated effort. Knights mounted on horseback would charge at the enemy with their lances poised to strike. A well-coordinated cavalry charge could break through enemy lines, causing chaos and fear in the opposing forces. Armies had to consider the ground they were marching on, as muddy fields or hilly landscapes could dramatically affect maneuverability. From the hierarchy of soldiers to the weapons they used, every aspect of the medieval battlefield was designed for maximum effectiveness. Knights and lords, foot soldiers, archers, and crossbowmen all played their parts in this complex dance of destruction, relying on strategy, weapons, and formations to achieve victory. While the weapons and tactics have evolved over time, the principles of medieval warfare, discipline, strategy, and the effective use of force remain the foundation of military conflict even today. These environmental factors added an unpredictable element to medieval warfare, making it a game of not just strategy but adaptation. Wet weather could turn a battlefield into a quagmire, slowing down both cavalry and infantry and causing logistical problems. On the other hand, open fields or hills could offer an advantage to archers or cavalry, allowing them to strike from a distance or charge with speed. Cavalry was typically used to target weak points in the enemy's formation or to chase down retreating soldiers. The psychological impact of cavalry charges, combined with their tactical mobility, made them an essential tool for medieval armies. This formation involves soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, with shields overlapping to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. This tactic often caught the enemy off guard, disrupting their formation and causing confusion. Ambushes, similarly, were an effective way to catch an opponent unaware, especially when fighting in forests or on uneven terrain. The use of terrain was critical in these tactics, as controlling high ground or hiding behind natural obstacles allowed for surprise attacks that could change the outcome of a battle. The shield wall allowed infantry to defend against cavalry charges or arrows, while providing stability and protection to soldiers in the front ranks. It was an ideal formation for holding ground, especially against cavalry. The ability to maneuver and use formations played a crucial role in determining the outcome of a battle. The siege tower was a massive wooden structure on wheels, allowing soldiers to scale the walls of a castle while protected from enemy fire. Maces were particularly useful against heavily armored opponents, as the blunt force of the blow could cause internal injuries, even if the armor withstood the initial strike. These weapons were often carried by foot soldiers, who used them to break through defenses or attack vulnerable spots in an enemy's armor. Swords were primarily used in melee combat, and knights practiced their swordsmanship for years to hone their skill. From the devastating swing of a sword to the long-range power of a bow, each weapon had its place on the battlefield, serving specific roles in different combat scenarios. Despite this, they were essential in battles, acting as the primary line of defense and holding key positions, such as gates or choke points. Longbowmen could shoot arrows over great distances, raining down volleys of arrows on enemy formations. The arrows themselves were often tipped with bodkin points, designed to penetrate armor, making the longbow an effective counter to the heavily armored knights, comprised of peasants, conscripts, and lower-ranking soldiers. Foot soldiers were typically armed with a variety of weapons, including swords, spears, halberds, and pikes. They were generally less well-trained and less well-equipped than knights, but their role was no less critical. Knights, the heavily armored cavalry of the medieval army, were among the most revered and elite soldiers on the battlefield. Mounted on horses, knights were the backbone of many medieval armies, and their presence alone often held significant psychological and tactical advantages. They were expected to fight with honor, defend the weak, and uphold the virtues of their code. However, the heavy armor and weaponry they wore made them less mobile and slower than infantry units, meaning that they typically relied on the support of foot soldiers and archers in battle. This made them particularly effective in breaking enemy formations or disrupting cavalry charges. While knights and foot soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand combat, longbowmen could remain at a distance, raining down arrows from afar. The cavalry's role was to break through enemy lines, create disruption, and strike fear into the opposing force. The sheer force of a knightly charge, particularly when combined with cavalry formations, could often determine the outcome of a battle. In addition, the psychological effect of a cavalry unit was powerful enemies often feared the crushing impact of a charge, which could break their ranks before they had a chance to defend themselves. Knights wore full suits of armor, often made from chainmail or, later in the Middle Ages, full plate armor, which provided both protection and weight. Their armor was designed to withstand blows from swords and axes, making them formidable opponents in close combat. The knight's primary weapon was often a long, heavy lance, which they could wield from horseback with deadly precision, charging through enemy lines at high speed. The knight's role was not just as a fighter, but as a symbol of chivalric ideals. The often overlooked infantry were the true backbone of medieval armies. Foot soldiers formed the front lines of battle, holding ground and providing support for the cavalry. While they were at a disadvantage in direct combat with knights, foot soldiers could turn the tide of battle with their sheer numbers and tactical formations. The role of archers and crossbowmen in medieval warfare became increasingly significant as the Middle Ages progressed, particularly during the 100 Years' War. The longbowmen's tactical advantage lay in their ability to deliver a continuous barrage of arrows, overwhelming the enemy with sheer volume. Crossbowmen, meanwhile, were often used as supplementary ranged units. Together, archers and crossbowmen added a critical dimension to medieval warfare, making them indispensable for both offensive and defensive operations. Medieval combat was a brutal affair, and the weapons used were designed for maximum effectiveness in close quarters. The sword, particularly the arming sword, was the iconic weapon of the knight. It was designed for cutting, thrusting, and blocking during combat. Axes and maces, while less common, were also vital tools in medieval warfare. The longbow was the medieval weapon that fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. It allowed soldiers to engage enemies from a distance, providing a tactical advantage. The 100 Years' War saw some of the most famous uses of the longbow, particularly by the English at the Battle of Agen, where English longbowmen decimated the French cavalry and infantry. Sieging a fortified city or castle was a major component of medieval warfare. Trebuchets were large, catapult-like machines used to hurl massive stones or fire projectiles at fortifications. Siege warfare often involved waiting for months, sometimes years, to breach defenses, making it a slow and grueling part of medieval conflict. Medieval battles were not just about individual heroics or prowess, but also about how effectively armies could organize and deploy their forces. One of the most common defensive tactics used by foot soldiers in medieval warfare was the shield war. The shield war was a tactic employed by various cultures, from the Anglo-Saxons in their defense against Viking raids to the Normans during their conquest of England. The charge of the cavalry was one of the most fearsome tactics in medieval warfare, Another important tactic was flanking, where smaller units of soldiers would maneuver around the enemy's defenses to attack from the sides or rear. Medieval warfare was heavily influenced by the terrain on which it was fought. The weather also played a role in tactics. Rain, snow, or extreme heat could force armies to alter their plans, often forcing battles to be delayed or rescheduled. In conclusion, medieval warfare was a brutal, multi-layered system of combat that combined individual bravery with complex tactical planning. Medieval battlefields were places of unimaginable chaos, a world where order collapsed and every soldier was left to grapple with the raw, brutal reality of combat. The cacophony of battle was deafening, unrelenting roar of sound that reverberated through the air, the earth beneath your feet trembling with the weight of the violence unfolding around you. It wasn't just the clash of steel against steel, the jarring impact of swords meeting shields, or the screams of the wounded. It was the thundering hooves of cavalry charging, the screams of men who were either celebrating victory or crying out in pain as they fell. Soldiers would find themselves lost in a haze of adrenaline, operating on sheer instinct. The movements of the soldiers felt mechanical, almost automatic. One swing of the sword, another clash with the enemy, then a hurried retreat to regroup. The weapons of the time swords, axes, maces, and palams were designed to cause maximum damage, and they succeeded. Injuries were brutal. Limbs could be hacked off in the heat of a brutal encounter, and some knights even lost fingers or entire hands, making it impossible for them to continue their fight. While there were barber surgeons, early medical practitioners, who could patch up wounds, the tools they used to treat wounds were rudimentary at best. Knives, hot irons, and saws. They lacked antiseptics or the sterile techniques we take for granted today. Even the bravest knights were sometimes paralyzed by the visceral realities of combat. The psychological effects of combat, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, disorder, were not understood in medieval times. Soldiers who returned from the front lines with the haunting memories of battle were often left to deal with these scars in silence. The intense fear, anxiety, flashbacks, and nightmares would follow them home. The screams, the chaos, the smells, and the brutality of it all were a constant reminder of the costs of war, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the emotional and physical scars that would remain long after the fighting ceased. The true cost of battle, the suffering, the trauma, and the sacrifice was paid by every soldier who fought, and it was carried with them long after they had left the battlefield. But there were no outlets for these emotions in a society that viewed warriors as strong, stoic figures. The psychological strain of constantly being on edge, knowing that a single moment of weakness could be fatal, was immense. Over time, this psychological toll could lead to what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The effects of combat did not simply fade with time. Soldiers who lived through horrific battles often experienced an ongoing sense of loss of comrades, of innocence, and of peace. They would go on to lead lives marked by emotional distance, fear, and a lack of connection to those who hadn't experienced the violence and terror of war. Yet in medieval times, this condition was often dismissed as weakness or cowardice. There were no support systems in place for those who carried the mental burden of war, and many were left to suffer in silence, struggling with the psychological weight of what they had done or witnessed. For many soldiers, this fear would manifest in ways that could overwhelm their courage. Yet, it was through sheer will and training that they could suppress the terror and continue fighting. This meant that even the smallest wound could become infected and fester, leading to gangrene, sepsis, and death. For those who survived the initial injury, the subsequent pain and suffering were often unbearable, leading to an agonizing death after the battle had ended. Swords could sever tendons, crippling limbs for life. The agony of these injuries was intensified by the knowledge that no immediate relief was available. The psychological toll of war was immense. Soldiers often had to return home after the battle to continue with their daily lives, yet the trauma they faced on the battlefield stayed with them. The constant threat of death, the fear of losing comrades, and the terrifying violence experienced in battle left psychological scars that lasted long after the fight ended. A sword could cleave through flesh, muscle, and bone, leaving deep, gaping wounds that would often result in severe blood loss. Axes and maces, with their crushing blows, could break bones and crush internal organs, inflicting wounds that would have been impossible to treat with the limited medical knowledge of the time. There was no time to think about anything but the next move. While bravery was essential in battle, fear was also a constant companion for every soldier. Before a battle, soldiers faced the anxiety of the unknown, whether they would survive, whether their comrades would be there to support them, and whether they would be able to face the overwhelming violence of the fight. The mental strain, too, was unbearable, this constant cycle of attack and retreat, where survival was the only goal. The very ground seemed alive with the sounds of death and conflict. In the heat of battle, the pungent aroma of sweat would fill the air. The intense physical effort of soldiers, their bodies drenched in sweat, beneath layers of metal armor combined with the earthy scent of mud and dust kicked up by the heavy boots of men marching and charging. Yet it was the smell of blood that overwhelmed the senses. The battlefield was soaked in it, from the injuries caused by swords and axes to the gruesome effects of maces and hammers on fragile bodies. Blood spilled not only from the wounded but from the many dead, soaking the earth beneath them. As soldiers engaged in battle, the confusion was palpable. The stench of decaying bodies left behind after the battle had subsided would linger in the air. Soldiers who died on the battlefield would often be left where they fell. As the battle raged on, and it would be days before proper burial rites could be observed, this smell of decay would permeate the battlefield, mixing with the odors of sweat and blood, creating an unbearable sensory overload that left its mark on everyone who survived. Imagine the chaos of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men fighting within a small area. The clash of iron and steel on shields rang out like thunder, the crack of swords meeting bone sending ripples through the crowd. Then, the scream of an injured soldier would break through the noise, a high-pitched wail of pain that blended with the sound of horses' hooves pounding the earth. The shouts of commanders shouting orders, the cries of rallying troops, and the frantic calls of soldiers trying to regroup or retreat all merged into an overwhelming auditory assault. In this pandemonium, visibility was often limited. The fog of war descended upon soldiers, making it nearly impossible to tell friend from foe. The smoke from burning villages, the dust kicked up by the foot soldiers and horses, and the natural fog of early morning battles or rainstorms clouded the air, making every swing of a weapon feel uncertain. You couldn't always see the person you were fighting, and in the press of battle, there was little chance to pause and question your actions. It was a disorienting. Experienced soldiers had to rely on instinct, muscle memory, and the orders of their commanders. As the fight around them blurred into a chaotic frenzy, the fear of misidentifying an ally, or worse, of being caught unaware by an enemy flank, was a constant, nagging threat. Even when you could see clearly, the horror of battle often made it impossible to process what was happening in the moment. The smells that filled the battlefield were no less disorienting, and perhaps the most distressing smell of all was that of death. The brutality of medieval warfare wasn't limited to the chaos of battle, it also lay in the physical toll that combat took on soldiers. Most soldiers did not die immediately from their wounds. They suffered for days, even weeks, after being struck. The mutilation of soldiers during battle was common. Even worse, most injuries were not treated on the battlefield with the care one might expect. The medieval battlefield, as brutal as it was, also bore witness to the scars that didn't show on the surface. The emotional and psychological toll of medieval warfare is something that is often overlooked in the tales of valor and heroism. This fear did not vanish in the heat of battle. In fact, it was often amplified by the chaos and violence that surrounded them. For those who survived, the trauma often continued long after the battle had ended. Many soldiers found themselves haunted by memories of the violence they had witnessed, the screams of dying men, the image of comrades falling beside them, the relentless brutality of the battlefield. For others, the trauma was repressed, creating deep emotional scars that lasted 4 years. Medieval warfare was a brutal, harrowing affair. The physical toll of battle, with its crippling wounds and gruesome injuries, was matched only by the psychological damage that soldiers endured. In medieval warfare, castles were more than just grand residences for the nobility. They were powerful fortifications that held strategic military importance and acted as symbols of control and authority. Castles were not only designed to provide defense against enemy attacks, but also served as key nodes in the broader feudal system, where controlling a castle meant controlling the surrounding lands and resources. Positioned atop hills or in strategic locations, castles gave their lords a clear view of the surrounding territory and protected vital routes, waterways, and fertile land. The goal of a siege was to force the defenders to surrender, either by overwhelming them with sheer force or starving them out. It was not just about breaking through the walls, but also about cutting off all routes for the defenders to escape or receive reinforcements. The limited resources inside the castle walls were consumed quickly, and without fresh supplies, the morale of the defenders began to deteriorate. The threat of starvation was a constant companion, and many defenders were forced to eat whatever scraps they could find, sometimes resorting to the unthinkable. The psychological strain of waiting for supplies to run out could be almost as devastating as the physical threat of the siege itself. Once a tunnel was completed beneath a wall or gate, the attackers would set fire to wooden supports, causing the structure to collapse. This cat-and-mouse game added a further level of tension to the siege, with both sides trying to outwit each other while fighting to preserve their lives. In some cases, the destruction was so catastrophic that entire sections of walls would collapse into rubble, allowing attackers to storm the castle. Castles were designed with the express purpose of withstanding attacks, especially in an era when military strategies focused on close combat and siege warfare, but also the constant emotional strain of knowing that the enemy was surrounding you, growing stronger with each passing day. At night, the sounds of battle would be replaced by the eerie quiet of uncertainty. The decision to surrender was often influenced by the number of supplies left, the health of the defenders, and the likelihood of reinforcement. Some defenders chose to die fighting rather than allow their fortress to fall to the enemy. The honor of holding the castle and defending it to the bitter end was considered a noble cause by some. However, the outcome of such decisions often led to unnecessary bloodshed, and many defenders were killed in a futile effort to hold ground that had already been lost. In some cases, a noble lord might choose to negotiate terms with the besieging force, offering to surrender in exchange for their lives or safe passage. However, the terms of such negotiations could vary widely, and in some cases, surrender would lead to brutal consequences, including executions, pillaging, and the burning of the castle. Would reinforcements arrive before the castle was breached? Would the attackers finally give up, or would they continue the siege until the defenders were broken? The defenders were trapped within the castle walls, cut off from the outside world. They lived in constant fear of death, knowing that even if the enemy forces did not breach the walls, starvation, disease, and internal strife might eventually take them down. It was a slow, brutal process that wore down both the body and the spirit. For the defenders, it was a battle of endurance, where survival depended on limited resources, the ability to hold strong in the face of overwhelming pressure, and, most often, sheer luck. For the besieging forces, it was a test of patience, resourcefulness, and persistence. Though siege warfare eventually gave way to newer technologies and strategies, the long agonizing process of attacking and defending a castle during a siege remains one of the most enduring images of medieval conflict. They had to live in cramped, unsanitary conditions, with limited access to food and water. Many castles did have storage for provisions, but these supplies would only last so long. The horrors of siege warfare, the starvation, the disease, the constant threat of death are a testament to the brutality of medieval conflict, and the length to which people would go to defend what they held most dear. As the siege dragged on, the defenders would become increasingly desperate, supplies would run low, and the psychological strain of waiting for a breakthrough or a rescue would begin to take its toll. One of the most infamous of these siege engines was a large, catapult-like machine capable of hurling massive stones, or even fire-filled projectiles over long distances. Trebuchets could demolish castle walls or destroy internal structures, making them one of the most fearsome weapons in medieval warfare. If the defenders began to lose hope, it could lead to surrender or even treason. However, if they could hold out long enough, there was the possibility of reinforcements arriving, or the besieging forces eventually retreating. This sense of uncertainty made the life of a defender on the battlefield even more emotionally and physically exhausting. The trebuchet's heavy stone projectiles were also used to cause panic among defenders, as the enormous stones would crash into walls and structures with deafening force. The besieging army would cut off all routes to and from the castle, preventing the defenders from receiving any supplies, reinforcements, or communication with the outside world. This included preventing trade and travel along nearby roads or waterways. The goal was to starve the defenders into submission. The thick stone walls, moats, drawbridges, and fortified gates were constructed to delay or prevent enemy forces from breaching the defenses. These projectiles were not just intended to cause physical damage, but also to create fear, spreading chaos and confusion. The scent of burning materials or the sight of dead bodies could add a psychological element to the siege, demoralizing defenders. For centuries, they were considered nearly impenetrable fortresses. Castles symbolized the power of the lord who ruled them, and they served as a place of refuge and defense during times of conflict. Their fortifications provided crucial protection for those inside, and their walls acted as a base from which military forces could control the surrounding area. However, castles were also seen as targets during times of war. Kings or invaders sought to expand their territories or remove powerful enemies. In addition to serving as defensive structures, castles also served as administrative centers. They were locations where military decisions were made and supplies were stored. A lord's military power was often measured by the number of castles under their control, and capturing a castle could shift the balance of power in the region. The siege of a castle therefore represented not only a military objective, but also a significant political and symbolic act. By successfully laying siege to a castle, an enemy could demoralize the defending forces, deplete the resources of a region, and shift the course of a war. A siege was a long, drawn-out process that could take months or even years to complete. One of the primary tactics used in sieging a castle was the blockade. Life inside the castle during a siege was grueling, as defenders had to ration food and water, often under terrible conditions. The attackers would also deploy various siege weapons to breach the castle walls, or provoke the defenders into submission. Another common siege weapon was the catapult, which could launch stones, fireballs, or even diseased corpses over the castle walls in an attempt to break the defenders' will. Another common siege tactic was undermining the walls. Soldiers would dig tunnels underneath the castle walls, sometimes for months at a time, to weaken the foundation. Undermining was a slow and dangerous process, as defenders would often attempt to detect and collapse tunnels by digging counter-tunnels. Life during a siege for those inside the castle. Life during a siege was often harrowing. The pressure inside the castle walls was intense. There were not only the physical effects of starvation and disease, morale among the defenders was key to surviving a siege. As the siege wore on, defenders faced a stark choice: surrender or fight to the death. Fighting to the death was, of course, the most dangerous option. In the case of prolonged sieges, the psychological toll on the defenders could be unbearable. Siege warfare in the medieval period was grueling, both for the attacking forces and the defenders. The psychological and physical toll on both sides in a siege was immense, and the decision to fight or surrender was often dictated not just by military strategy, but by the mental and emotional state of those involved. Medieval warfare, with its protracted and devastating nature, had far-reaching social and economic consequences, particularly for the lower classes, who were the least equipped to cope with the toll of constant conflict. Feudal societies, characterized by the relationship between lords and vassals, depended heavily on the willingness of vassals to provide troops for warfare. This system placed an immense burden on the common folk, who were often called upon to serve as soldiers or laborers during times of war. Peasants, who did not own land or wealth, were expected to support the wars through forced service or by providing resources like food, tools, and materials. Villagers were often caught in the crossfire of feudal conflicts, with homes and fields being destroyed in battles or sieges. When armies moved through rural areas, they often destroyed everything in their path. The rebuilding process was slow and difficult. Many villages and towns were left abandoned, with their inhabitants either killed in battle or forced to flee to safer regions. The effects on the local population were devastating, as many found themselves without work, food, or shelter. It was not uncommon for survivors to struggle for years after a conflict, unable to restore the land to its previous state of productivity. Warfare had significant political consequences as well, often leading to profound shifts in the balance of power within feudal societies. Battles between kings, lords, and other nobles were not just about territorial control, but about asserting dominance and securing a right to rule. This could mean the redistribution of land, the change of allegiances, or even the forced renunciation of titles and rights. In an effort to consolidate power and centralize authority, many kings used war as a tool to undermine the influence of their noble vassals. Kings like William the Conqueror of England and Philip II of France used military campaigns to expand their control and diminish the power of the nobility. The growth of powerful monarchies undermined the authority of the local lords, and this shift often caused tensions between the crown and the nobility. The peasantry, who were already heavily taxed and burdened by the demands of war, became increasingly dissatisfied with their lot. One of the most famous examples is the Peasants' Revolt in England, where thousands of common folk rose up against the harsh taxation and exploitation they faced. These revolts were often brutally suppressed, but they were a reflection of the deepening divide between the ruling elite and the common people. As warfare intensified, the nobility's pursuit of power became increasingly disconnected from the realities of the peasantry's daily life, causing resentment and rebellion. It also fostered political instability, as kings sought to consolidate power, while the nobility struggled to maintain their autonomy. It was a time of upheaval, where war was an instrument of both destruction and transformation, reshaping the very foundations of medieval society. The impact of constant warfare was not just felt by the armies on the battlefield, but by the people who lived through it, the peasants, soldiers, and families who saw their lives upended by the conflicts waged in their name. In many cases, they were forced to fight battles that had nothing to do with them, while their homes and livelihoods were destroyed. These tensions sometimes erupted into rebellions or civil wars, as lords fought to preserve their power and autonomy in the face of increasingly centralized authority. The creation of centralized states, where the king held ultimate authority over the land, was a direct result of this strategy. The Jacquerie in France and the German Peasants' War are other examples where uprisings were driven by the burden of war and exploitation. The constant need for soldiers and resources took its toll on the common folk, who bore the brunt of the cost of war. The feudal system, with its levies and obligations, ensured that the lower classes were the ones who paid for the ambitions of their rulers. The devastation of the land, the heavy taxation required to fund military campaigns, and the social unrest caused by the burdens of warfare all contributed to the fragile social fabric of medieval society. In these cases, the centralizing monarchs and local lords were forced to address the grievances of the lower classes, even if only in the short term. In many cases, warfare led to the rise of new rulers or kingdoms, as weaker states were absorbed by stronger ones. Through battle, political power was redefined, and the structures of feudal society were continually The outcome of a battle could shift the political landscape dramatically, as losing rulers or lords were often dethroned or forced to flee. The control of castles and strategic strongholds was essential in these power struggles, as those who held them could dictate the terms of peace or war. They built standing armies that were directly controlled by the crown, which gradually replaced the feudal levies of knights and vassals. This shift not only changed the way wars were fought, but also laid the groundwork for the modern state. Kings who could command these armies were able to enforce their will over the nobility, leading to more stable rule. Fields were burned, villages looted, and homes reduced to rubble. The scorched earth tactics employed by some armies intentionally sought to destroy food supplies and infrastructure, starving the enemy into submission. However, this strategy had a long-term impact on the people who lived there. What had once been fertile land, tended by hard-working peasants, was often left in ruins. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, and agricultural tools destroyed, crippling local economies and preventing peasants from producing food for their families. Those who lived on the fringes of larger estates often had no protection from the destruction wrought by the armies that marched through their lands. Many peasants saw their homes looted and their crops burned, leaving them with nothing. Kings and lords demanded high taxes from their subjects to fund military campaigns, and the people often had no choice but to comply. While the nobility fought their battles and the royalty built fortresses and raised armies, it was the peasants who often saw their resources drained and their livelihoods destroyed. These high taxes made it difficult for farmers to maintain their land and feed their families. In many cases, they had no choice but to resort to borrowing from the local lord or moneylenders, which kept them in a cycle of debt and poverty. The economic burden of war, therefore, fell squarely on the shoulders of the common people, who rarely saw any benefits from the conflicts being waged in their name. Taxes were levied on land, goods, and income, and in times of war, these demands intensified. The wealthier classes, especially the nobility, could usually afford to pay the taxes imposed by their rulers. But for the lower classes, it was often a matter of survival. Many peasants had to sell off their property or borrow money to pay taxes, leaving them even more vulnerable to the next wave of conflict. The burden of war disproportionately affected them, as their labor was essential to maintaining agricultural production, yet much of their work was interrupted by the needs of military campaigns. When armies marched across the countryside, they often requisitioned food and supplies from the peasant population, leaving farmers with little to survive on. Warfare in medieval times was predominantly financed through feudal levies, service that vassals owed to their lord in exchange for land or protection. When a lord or king needed to wage war, they would summon their vassals to provide soldiers, sometimes in the form of knights, infantry, or support staff. Knights and other soldiers were required to fight for their lords or kings, which could lead to months or even years of military service, often far from home. The consequences of these levies were harsh, especially for the lower classes. For the common folk, the cost of war wasn't just measured in labor and resources, it was also a matter of survival. The devastation caused by war was felt most acutely in the countryside, where the majority of the population lived. Even after the fighting had moved on, the remnants of war lingered. The financing of warfare was another strain on medieval society. The common people, especially the peasants, felt the strain of these taxes acutely. The social and economic consequences of medieval warfare were not limited to the immediate effects on the population. Medieval warfare was a crucial mechanism by which power was acquired and lost. When a battle was lost, the victors would often impose new terms on the defeated. Over time, the constant conflict between feudal lords and vassals contributed to the rise of strong monarchies. By weakening the power of individual lords and nobles through warfare, monarchs could establish stronger, more cohesive kingdoms. However, this centralization came at the expense of the feudal system. The burden of constant warfare coupled with the economic devastation it caused inevitably led to social unrest and uprisings. In response to this injustice, peasant revolts became a common feature of medieval warfare. In some cases, these revolts led to significant political changes, though the effects were often temporary. Medieval warfare left deep and lasting marks on society, politics, and the economy. Politically, warfare reshaped kingdoms and empires, leading to the rise of stronger monarchies at the expense of the nobility's power. The legacy of medieval warfare lies not only in the battles won and lost, but in the profound social and political changes it triggered. Feudal warfare, which had defined much of the medieval period, saw its gradual decline beginning in the late Middle Ages, marking a shift that would forever alter the course of military history. This transformation was driven by several interwoven factors, including the rise of standing armies, the introduction of gunpowder weapons, and the growing centralization of power within emerging nations. By the end of the 14th century, many monarchs began to recognize the limitations of relying on feudal levies for warfare. These temporary, untrained forces, raised by calling upon vassals and their retinues, were difficult to mobilize and lacked consistency. While knights and vassals remained important in certain battles, the rise of these professional soldiers heralded the beginning of a new era in warfare. The decline of castles as military strongholds, and the need to defend against artillery, led to changes in the design of forts, such as the creation of star-shaped fortresses with angled walls to better withstand cannon fire. Over time, the use of gunpowder weapons became a dominant factor in warfare, making the armored knight and the heavily fortified castle less relevant on the battlefield. The fragmentation of power between kings and their vassals, which had characterized the feudal system, was replaced by more centralized states, where rulers held direct control over larger, more uniform military forces. This centralization of power helped to bring an end to the localized warfare between feudal lords, replacing it with broader conflicts between nations. The increasing authority of monarchs meant that warfare became a tool for expanding and defending the boundaries of a centralized kingdom, rather than a means for individual lords to assert their power. While cavalry charges became less common as gunpowder weapons gained prominence, the importance of mounted units did not disappear entirely. In many battles during the early modern period, mounted units were still used to strike fear into the enemy or to break through weak points in the opponent's lines. The continued use of cavalry in these roles demonstrates the lasting legacy of medieval military practices. Cavalry continued to play a crucial role in reconnaissance, communication, and flanking maneuvers well into the early modern period. The introduction of gunpowder and artillery prompted changes in the design of military strongholds. The importance of fortified positions persisted into the World Wars, where trench warfare and the strategic use of defensive positions played a pivotal role in the nature of combat. The myth of the knight-armored, chivalric warrior, who lived by a code of honor. The concept of the knight as a paragon of virtue has been passed down through generations, shaping our understanding of what it means to be a hero. This idealized view of knights has permeated stories from Arthurian legends to modern films like The Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. Even video games like The Witcher or For Honor draw on the archetype of the knight as a central figure, where players are tasked with embodying chivalric values as they engage in combat and adventure. And chivalry that were cultivated during the feudal period continued to shape how we understand and interact with historical narratives in the modern world. From the rise of standing armies and the introduction of gunpowder to the transformation of military strategy and the enduring cultural myths surrounding knights, the legacy of this era continues to influence the modern world. The myths of chivalry and knighthood have become ingrained in our collective consciousness, shaping our understanding of heroism and the moral codes that guide individuals in times of conflict. The modern fascination with medieval combat reflects a deep, almost timeless, admiration for the courage, sacrifice, and honor associated with knights. The evolution from feudal levies and knight-led charges to the modern professional military force is a testament to the adaptability and resilience of warfare over time. And as long as the tales of knights, castles, and battles for honor persist in literature, film, and games, the cultural legacy of feudal warfare will continue to captivate and inspire. In literature and film, knights are often portrayed as noble figures, battling against dark forces, embodying the timeless ideals of courage and honor. And Fought for Justice continues to captivate our culture, influencing everything from literature to films to video games. Castles, once impenetrable, were now vulnerable to bombardment. The tales of King Arthur and his knights have been retold and reinterpreted countless times, from Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur to modern films and television. In these stories, knights are depicted as noble warriors engaged in epic quests, often driven by ideals of justice, honor, and love. These ideals of knightly behavior continue to shape how we perceive leadership, heroism, and personal sacrifice in contemporary media. The organized, disciplined formations of medieval armies evolved into the more modern, coordinated battalions and regiments. While modern technology has drastically changed the tools of war, the basic principles of maneuver, defense, and coordination that were developed in the feudal era remain relevant. The medieval use of formations like the shield wall, where soldiers stood shoulder to form an impenetrable defense, evolved into more sophisticated battlefield strategies. Games like Dark Souls, For Honor, and Mount and Blade immerse players in the world of medieval combat, where they can step into the shoes of a knight, engage in battles, and make decisions based on honor and duty. These games evoke the same romanticized vision of knights and warfare, where the player is tasked with fighting for a noble cause, adhering to chivalric codes, and proving their valor on the battlefield. Over time, military thinkers and tacticians adapted these ancient formations into the more advanced tactics used by modern armies, including the use of flanking, artillery support, and combined arms. However, this shift also led to the evolution of star forts and other fortified structures, designed specifically to withstand artillery fire. These advanced fortifications would influence military architecture for centuries. The shift from cavalry charges to artillery and infantry-led assaults fundamentally changed the nature of military tactics, making feudal strategies obsolete. Military campaigns could now be planned and executed with greater coordination and precision. The decline of feudal armies and the rise of professional soldiers marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, one that would lay the groundwork for the modern military. The first gunpowder weapons, such as hand cannons, early firearms, and cannons were introduced in the 14th century and slowly began to change the dynamics of combat. The tactics and technologies developed during the medieval period had a profound and lasting impact on modern warfare, from the use of cavalry in the early battles to the establishment of fortified military strongholds. These weapons had several advantages over traditional medieval arms. They were easier to use, required less training, and had the ability to breach even the strongest of castle walls. As warfare became more frequent and widespread, the need for a permanent military force became evident. Kings and rulers began to establish standing armies, professional soldiers who were paid and trained year. This shift towards permanent military forces gave rulers more control over their military capabilities, ensuring that they had a reliable and skilled fighting force when needed. The development of standing armies allowed for more complex military strategies and more organized campaigns, which were difficult for the decentralized feudal system to match. The introduction of gunpowder in the late Middle Ages further hastened the decline of feudal warfare. The cannon, in particular, proved to be a game, as it could destroy fortifications and render traditional medieval castles and fortresses vulnerable. Centralized states and the end of feudal fragmentation as kings and monarchs established standing armies. They also began to centralize political power, consolidating authority over vast territories and reducing the influence of the traditional feudal lords. The rise of strong monarchies also led to the creation of more efficient bureaucracies, which were necessary to maintain and support standing armies. While the feudal era of warfare ended, its innovations and strategies continued to shape the future of military conflict. The role of the cavalry in medieval warfare, particularly the knights on horseback, continued to influence military strategies, even as firearms and gunpowder became more dominant. The cavalry charge, once the centerpiece of medieval combat, was gradually replaced by more advanced tactics, but the psychological impact of cavalry remained strong. The role of castles and fortifications in medieval warfare laid the foundation for the development of modern military defense structures. Even as gunpowder and firearms revolutionized warfare, the principles of defense such as the use of strategic locations, the importance of controlling high ground, and the fortification of key positions. Feudal warfare also contributed to the development of military strategy. The medieval focus on close-quarters combat, often fought in tight formations, laid the groundwork for modern military doctrine. While the technological and strategic aspects of medieval warfare have evolved, the cultural legacy of feudal warfare has remained a prominent part of modern imagination. The ideals of chivalry, bravery, loyalty, fairness, and the protection of the weak continue to be romanticized today. In modern popular culture, knights are often shown as larger-than-life figures, fighting not only for power or glory but for a greater moral cause. The Arthurian legend, with its Knights of the Round Table, is perhaps the most enduring example of the romanticized version of medieval warfare. Feudal warfare's cultural legacy is especially apparent in the world of video games. Even though these games are set in fictionalized worlds, the core principles of medieval warfare, the impact of feudal warfare extends far beyond its role in shaping the history of the Middle Ages. Feudal warfare, despite its decline, remains a powerful force in popular culture and military history. Medieval warfare was far from the glorified vision of knights in shining armor that we often encounter in stories and popular culture. In reality, it was brutal, grueling, and unforgiving. From the intense and exhausting battles fought between knights and soldiers to the unrelenting toll of sieges that left entire villages destroyed, the cost of war was immeasurable. The physical toll on the soldiers suffered not just in the chaos of battle, but also in the harsh conditions of sieges was immense. The heroes of the battlefield, knights, kings, and warriors, became symbols of bravery, honor, and sacrifice. The stories of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and the ideals of chivalry and knightly valor have endured through the ages, inspiring countless generations. These tales, born out of real historical conflicts, grew into powerful symbols of medieval heroism legends that continue to shape our understanding of leadership, duty, and sacrifice. The struggles, the chivalric codes, the betrayals, and the heroic acts of valor were transformed into myths that would persist for centuries. These tales of medieval heroism, though often born from the tragedy of war, became woven into the cultural fabric of the time, celebrated in epic poems, literature, and oral tradition. Wounded men were often left to die from infections or the lack of medical care. The emotional and psychological toll was no less significant. Soldiers faced a relentless cycle of fear, exhaustion, and trauma that haunted them long after the battles were over. For the common people, the effects of medieval warfare were even more pronounced. Entire villages were destroyed, fields burned, and lives upended as lords and kings fought for control and power. As monarchs and lords fought for dominance, they forged new alliances, conquered territories, and, in some cases, established stronger, centralized powers that eventually led to the rise of modern nations. Those who were caught in the crossfire of feudal conflicts saw their homes, livelihoods, and families torn apart. And while kings and lords fought for glory and power, it was the common folk who bore the heaviest burden of war, their lives disrupted, their homes ruined, their resources drained by the endless demands of taxation and military service. The political landscape was equally shaped by warfare. The rise and fall of kingdoms and the shifting balance of power were often determined by the outcomes of battles and sieges. However, despite the devastation and tragedy that war brought, medieval warfare also gave rise to legends. And so, as we move forward in this exploration, we will delve into how these real, often tragic events were transformed into the myths and legends that continue to captivate us today. Now, let us explore the mythic transformation of these medieval events, where the gritty reality of warfare was polished and reimagined into the stories that have endured for centuries. Feudalism was the dominant social, political, and economic system of medieval Europe, lasting from roughly the 9th century to the 15th century. It was based on a hierarchical structure where land and loyalty were exchanged for military service and protection. They had few rights, were subject to the will of their lord, and were required to work the land in exchange for protection and the right to cultivate a portion for themselves. While the serfs were not slaves, they had very little freedom, trapped in an unbreakable contract that kept them tied to the land. The king was typically seen as the ultimate landowner. the one who granted fiefs to his loyal nobles, and, theoretically, had dominion over all of his realm. Kings often had to rely on diplomacy, coercion, and force to keep their vassals loyal. The feudal system often led to conflict, as lords sought to increase their own power at the expense of the monarch's authority. The king's power was not absolute, and any sign of weakness could lead to rebellions or feudal revolts, where powerful lords would challenge the monarch's rule, sometimes resulting in civil war. As monarchs developed centralized states, they were able to diminish the power of local lords, leading to long-term changes in the political landscape. However, his control was frequently limited by the independent power of his vassals, particularly the high lords or barons, who often ruled large swaths of land and had their own armies. Lords were typically powerful landowners who controlled extensive territories, and their primary source of wealth and power was land. As vassals acquired more land and wealth, they began to wield greater political and military power. This could lead to a vassal becoming more independent from their lord and, in some cases, could result in rebellion. This made the feudal contract a double-edged sword for vassals. While some vassals remained loyal to the crown, others used their power to challenge the king. Kings, lords, and vassals all played vital roles in maintaining this system, which was central to both the political and military dynamics of the time. However, as the feudal system evolved and monarchs began to consolidate power, it led to the rise of strong, centralized states, laying the groundwork for modern political systems. This tension between central authority and local power would eventually contribute to the rise of strong monarchies and the eventual centralization of power that replaced the feudal system in the later Middle Ages. The consequences of this shift were felt far beyond the battlefield and would mark the beginning of a new era in European history. On one hand, loyalty could result in rewards such as land, prestige, or military power. On the other hand, the demands made by the lord could become overwhelming, leading to economic hardship or the involvement in bloody conflicts for which the vassal had little personal stake. Powerful vassals, like those with significant military forces or alliances, sometimes became threats to the lord's authority. The classic example of this dynamic occurred in medieval France and England, where powerful barons or nobles frequently fought for control of their lands, at times undermining the monarch's authority. While a lord was responsible for protecting his vassals and their lands, the vassals were responsible for military service and loyalty. In theory, a vassal owed the lord only military service and personal loyalty, but in practice, this relationship was often far more complex. Lords had the right to raise armies and wage wars, both to defend their territories and to expand their influence. These wars often occurred without the involvement of the king, as local lords used their military power to further their own political agendas. The frequent conflict between lords and vassals, or between rival lords, kept the political landscape of medieval Europe in constant flux. Lords could demand various types of support, such as taxes, men for war, or even the vassal's involvement in internal governance. In some cases, lords could impose arbitrary demands, testing the loyalty of their vassals. In return for military service or loyalty, lords granted portions of land to their vassals, who swore to provide support and serve the lord when called upon. During this war, the English crown saw its power challenged both by its own nobles and by the French monarchy, as each sought to assert dominance over the other. Powerful monarchs, such as King Henry II of England and Philip II of France, used military might and strategic diplomacy to consolidate their power during this period. Henry II, for example, used his control over vast lands in both England and France to strengthen his position, but was also continuously challenged by his own barons and vassals, leading to tensions that ultimately resulted in his son's rebellion. At its core, the system was organized around the control of land and the obligations tied to it, rather than centralized state power. After William the Conqueror claimed the English throne, he implemented a feudal system that granted land to his followers in exchange for loyalty and military service. By doing so, he ensured that his vassals were both bound to him and dependent on him, creating a more centralized form of control in England. The system was not uniform across Europe, but the general principles were similar. The king owned the land, which he granted to high lords or barons in exchange for military service. Warfare was conducted by feudal levies, military service rendered by the vassals to their lords, where vassals provided a certain number of soldiers or knights in times of war. This decentralized military structure meant that armies were often composed of local levies raised by individual lords or kings, which could limit the size and efficiency of armies compared to modern standing armies. Wealth was also distributed based on land ownership. Lords controlled vast amounts of land and wealth, while peasants worked the land and received little in return. These high lords would, in turn, grant portions of their land to lesser lords or vassals, who would provide soldiers and military aid when called upon. At the bottom of this structure were the serfs, peasants bound to the land. The core of feudal society was the feudal contract, a set of mutual obligations between lords and vassals. Vassals pledged loyalty and service to their lord in exchange for land or protection, while the lord promised to defend his vassals and their holdings. The relationship was bound by oaths of fealty, formal oaths of loyalty that made it a legal and moral duty for the vassal to provide military service and resources in times of war. For a lord, breaking this bond could lead to the loss of land or political power. For a vassal, disloyalty could result in the loss of land and protection. This system profoundly shaped the military and social dynamics of medieval society. At the top of the feudal hierarchy was the king, whose power was often more symbolic than actual in a system where local lords held much of the real authority. Maintaining centralized control in such a decentralized system was a constant struggle. One of the most famous instances of this struggle for power occurred during the 100 Years' War, a protracted conflict between England and France. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is another key example of how kings used feudal warfare to assert control. Even when a king was able to consolidate power, it came at the expense of weakening the traditional feudal structure. The relationship between lords and vassals was essential to the functioning of the feudal system. The feudal contract formalized this exchange, and it was vital to the social and military order of the time. However, this system of loyalty also created tensions and competition. In some instances, lords also faced conflicts with rival lords, leading to battles or entire wars between feudal lords. As lords grew stronger, they could begin to demand more from their vassals, not just land and loyalty, but also military service and economic resources. As vassals gained more autonomy and power, the balance of power between the monarch and the nobility was constantly in flux. The feudal system shaped medieval society and its military landscape in profound ways, creating a rigid hierarchy of power that was based on land, loyalty, and military service. In the next segment, we will explore the rise of centralized monarchies and how kings began to assert more direct control over their realms, challenging the traditional feudal structures and transforming the political landscape of medieval Europe. Castles were not simply residences for medieval lords and nobles. They were symbols of power, security, and control. In the feudal system, land was synonymous with power, and castles were the physical manifestation of that control. They allowed the lord not only to safeguard his own life, but also to assert dominance over the surrounding territory. Early castles, often called matandabali designs, consisted of a wooden structure atop a mound, with a courtyard surrounded by a wooden fence. Over time, these were replaced by stone fortifications, which were more durable and could withstand artillery fire, making them harder to breach. The strategic location of a castle was critical, and the construction of castles was carefully planned to maximize defense, while also serving as effective centers for governance, trade, and military organization. Castles were almost always located in high or defensible positions, such as hillsides or riverbanks. The elevation provided a commanding view of the surrounding area, allowing the lord to monitor any approaching threats from rival lords or invaders. This was one of the most vulnerable parts of the castle, so it was heavily fortified. Cannons and bombards could now damage stone walls, leading to the star-shaped forts, designed with angled walls to deflect cannon fire. Despite these advancements, the core role of castles remained as a military stronghold and symbol of control. The grand banquet halls were centers of social life, where feasts were held in honor of important events, visitors, or victories. These gatherings were not only about sustenance, but also about reinforcing social hierarchy, and soldiers, who maintained the castle's day-to-day operations, including food preparation, weapon crafting, and building repairs. These people had little in terms of wealth or status, but were essential to keeping the castle running. Lords, ladies, and knights dined at long tables, with musicians and entertainers providing amusement, while the lower-ranked servants, laborers, and squires would eat separately or in service to their superiors. but for reinforcing the relationships that would help maintain the political and military power of the family. Minstrels, bards, and court scholars could be found in castles, preserving the oral traditions of the time and providing entertainment, as well as spreading news and tales from afar. Tournaments, jousting, matches, and feasts served to strengthen the bonds of loyalty between the lord and his knights. They projected the lord's power over the land, creating a physical representation of his control. For the common people, castles represented the absolute authority of their lords and served as reminders of the social hierarchy. Defined their lives. Castles were not only centers of defense and governance, but also hubs for cultural exchange and diplomatic negotiation. The presence of these formidable fortresses played a crucial role in shaping the landscape of medieval Europe, providing both security and leverage for those who controlled them. From the daily life of noble families to the complex political games played between feuding lords, the castle was at the heart of medieval power. As we move forward, we'll look deeper into the impact of feudal warfare and how it influenced the rise and fall of castles and, ultimately, the lords who relied on them. For enemies, the castle represented an almost insurmountable obstacle, often a place of both literal and symbolic resistance. In times of peace, the castle was a sanctuary for the lord's family and vassals. In times of war, it was the rallying point for troops and the first line of defense against invasion. Castles were deliberately designed to be imposing, with towering walls, moats, and gatehouses that intimidated both local peasants and rival lords. These fortifications reinforced the idea that the lord could defend his land from any threat, and that his power was absolute within his domain. These courts were essential in maintaining the law and order of the region, as well as protecting the rights of the people who lived on the land. The lord had the final say in matters of property disputes, land rights, and even the punishment of criminals. These decisions could be enforced through the threat of military force, with soldiers stationed in the castle ready to take action if necessary. The chivalric code was often celebrated during these events, reminding everyone of the ideals of bravery, loyalty, and honor that knights were expected to uphold. Rivers were also a critical feature for castles, as they not only served as a natural barrier, but also provided a vital source of water for drinking and defending the castle. At the top were the lord and lady, who made decisions about the governance and management of the estate. The lord's court was where the political business of the estate was conducted. This was a place where disputes were settled, laws were enforced, and taxes were collected. Castles were often located in strategic trade routes, meaning that lords could impose tolls on merchants traveling through their land. These tolls were a critical source of income for the lord, who could use the profits to fund military campaigns or maintain the lavish lifestyle of his court. As the lords of the land, they had the power to protect merchants and ensure the safety of the trade routes, but they also had the power to levy taxes and charges on the goods being exchanged. Below them were knights who performed military service in exchange for land or titles. Beneath the knights were the squires and pages, young men and boys who served the knights and learned the skills required to become a knight themselves. Castles along rivers could control key trade routes, further increasing their economic importance. Lords, ladies, and knights lived relatively luxurious lives, afforded the comforts and privileges of their status. However, life in a castle was not always as romanticized as it might seem. The stone walls provided safety, but they were also cold and dark, with limited heating and natural light. Still, compared to the humble conditions of peasants, the nobility enjoyed significant comfort and wealth. By controlling these strategic positions, the lord could secure his domain and project power over surrounding lands. Castles were designed to withstand prolonged sieges and attacks, evolving in complexity and strength over time. These tall structures were used to keep watch over the surrounding land and, during a siege, acted as a stronghold for the lord and his family. Key architectural features of castles included moats. These water-filled ditches served as a physical barrier to invaders, and were often complemented by drawbridges that could be raised in times of danger to prevent access. High walls. Castles boasted thick, high walls that were difficult to scale and offered a commanding position for defenders to repel attackers. Towers. Castles typically included watchtowers or keeps at their core. Gatehouses and drawbridges. The gates of a castle were usually reinforced with heavy timber or iron bars and protected by a drawbridge, which could be raised or lowered to prevent entry. With the advent of gunpowder and artillery in the later medieval period, castles had to evolve further. Inside the fortress-like walls of a castle, life for the nobility contrasted dramatically with that of the peasants who worked the land. Lords and their families enjoyed abundant food, protection, and services, with access to the finest amenities available in the medieval world. The social structure within the castle was rigid, mirroring the broader feudal hierarchy. The lower levels of the castle's society consisted of servants, artisans. Social events were an important part of life in a castle. Not just for entertainment, castles were also sites for education and learning. The children of noble families were often educated within the castle walls, learning to read, write, and manage the family estate. Castles were not only military and residential structures, but also vital centers of administration and governance. Lords used their castles as places to hold court and deal with the legal matters of their territories. Lords also had a significant role in controlling trade in their regions. Perhaps most importantly, castles were symbols of authority and dominance. The castle's psychological role in feudal society cannot be overstated. In the next segment, we will explore how castles, their lords, and their vassals interacted within the broader context of medieval warfare and feudal politics. In medieval feudal society, the role of noble women was far more complex and significant than often acknowledged in popular depictions of medieval life. While noble women were not typically involved in the direct conduct of warfare or government, their political influence was deeply embedded within the structures of feudal power. The medieval manor, often consisting of a lord's estate, was not only a center of agricultural production, but also a hub for social and political life. They were raised to take part in the complex power dynamics of the medieval world. Marriage, family alliances, and inheritance were areas where women could assert their influence, often securing or bolstering their family's power and ensuring its political survival through well-arranged unions. Marriages were arranged for political, economic, and social reasons. Eleanor was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, inheriting vast territories in France. Her marriage to Henry II in 1152 was a political masterstroke, bringing large swaths of France into English control. In the Holy Roman Empire, the marriage between Emperor Frederick II and Isabella of Jerusalem in the 13th century solidified the connection between the Hohenstaufen dynasty and the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. When a woman inherited land from her father or husband, it became a source of her power. A regent was typically a noble woman who governed in place of a husband or son during times of war, absence, or minority. These regents were often women of exceptional skill, trusted to maintain the kingdom or territory. Many women, especially widows, controlled large estates that were critical to their family's success and wealth. In the late 15th century, Isabella's leadership saw the completion of the expulsion of the Moors from Spain. In times of crisis or transition, noble women often stepped forward to fill the power vacuum, demonstrating that women, even in an era that heavily restricted their freedoms, could hold immense political sway. And the sponsorship of Christopher Columbus's journey to the New World. As the heads of large estates, they were responsible for administering justice, upholding laws, and overseeing the well-being of those in their care. Though often overshadowed by their male counterparts, the influence of women in medieval Europe cannot be overstated. The feudal system, while heavily skewed towards male authority, created opportunities for women to assert their power in ways that would influence European history for centuries to come. We will now look at how the rise of powerful monarchies, the role of religion, and the changing nature of feudalism reshaped both the lives of noble women and the broader political landscape of medieval Europe. Their influence extended to the church as well, where they could act as benefactors, founding churches and monasteries or supporting religious orders. Her reign, despite being overshadowed by her husband's achievements, was marked by immense political and military influence. These women were often tasked with managing not just their property, but the political, economic, and social activities associated with it. When Henry VI descended into madness, Margaret effectively became the leader of the Lancastrian cause, playing a central role in the dynastic conflict. She raised armies, negotiated with allies, and sought to preserve her husband's throne. Figures such as Christine de Pizan and Helen, who was involved in the intellectual culture of the medieval church, have left a lasting legacy in medieval literature and philosophy. Her political acumen and persistence in a male-dominated world exemplified how women could not only hold power, but could also shape the political landscape of their time. The wealth and resources from such estates enabled them to play an active role in maintaining their family's political fortunes. Similarly, in France, the marriage between Louis VII and Constance of Castile was part of a broader strategy to secure alliances in Iberia and expand the French monarchy's influence in the region. The marriage provided Henry with crucial territories and power, but it also linked Eleanor to a royal dynasty that would define English history. After her marriage to Henry II, Eleanor often played a pivotal role in the politics of the British Isles and France. When her sons rebelled against Henry II in the 1170s, Eleanor supported their efforts and even led military campaigns on their behalf. She was a powerful figure who wielded considerable influence both in her own right and as a member of the English royal family. This union was not just a personal relationship, it was a marriage between kingdoms, a merger of lands that gave Henry political leverage in both England and France. Through marriage, noble families could strengthen their political ties, acquire more land, or secure alliances with other powerful houses. Throughout her marriage, she was politically active, particularly in the governance of their shared lands. When Henry was away, Eleanor often took charge of the family's lands, wielding significant political and military influence. Even more, during a period of rebellion by their sons against Henry, Eleanor played a role in supporting their effort, showing that her influence extended beyond the typical realm of female power. These unions were often the result of strategic planning that served to strengthen one's position in the intricate feudal network. They lived in castles or large estates, often in relative comfort compared to their lower-class counterparts. Ladies of the manor were educated, often learning literature, languages, economics, and political strategy, depending on the needs of their families. They might not have been warriors on the battlefield, but they wielded a different kind of power that was political, economic, and social. Ladies of the manor were responsible for overseeing this operation. This included managing the financial affairs of the estate, organizing labor, and sometimes even controlling the distribution of land. A lady's skills in management, negotiation, and patience were as critical as any knight's ability in combat. They were not simply wives, mothers, or daughters. They played vital roles as estate managers, diplomatic agents, and cultural patrons. In many ways, the women of the nobility were the glue that held the feudal system together, as they managed estates, maintained alliances, and sometimes shaped the course of political events. The lives of noble women were marked by their position in the household and the domestic sphere, but their influence extended well beyond these traditional roles. While common women lived hard lives, working in the fields, or caring for families and villages, noble women had access to a significantly different way of life. Though their lives may have been constrained by gender roles and patriarchy, noble women were still capable of significant political maneuvering, particularly within the highly stratified world of feudalism. In feudal society, marriage was much more than a personal or romantic commitment. It was often a political tool. One of the most famous and significant marriages in medieval history was that of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was not simply a passive participant in this union. Other examples of marriages serving political purposes can be found across Europe. A noble woman's dowry could include more than just wealth. It often included land, which, in a society where land equaled power, was a vital asset. While most noble women did not rule kingdoms outright, many had opportunities to exercise power as regents. One of the most famous regents in medieval history was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who not only governed the vast territories of Aquitaine in France, but also ruled as a regent of England. Another example is Margaret of Anjou, who was queen consort of Henry VI of England during the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. Isabella of Castile, another remarkable medieval queen, famously ruled alongside her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, and jointly laid the foundations for the unification of Spain. These women were far more than passive figures waiting in the wings of male rulers. They were active, political agents who often made critical decisions that affected the course of history. In addition to their political influence through marriage and regency, noble women often wielded power through their roles as patrons of the arts, religious figures, and moral authorities. Noble women also played a key role in shaping culture. Many were patrons of the literature and arts, commissioning works of art, poetry, and music. By carefully navigating the constraints of medieval gender roles, noble women were able to shape the political, cultural, and social landscapes of their time. In the next segment, we will explore how these powerful women interacted with their male counterparts, as well as the broader political and social dynamics that allowed them to shape medieval society. In the medieval world, the political landscape was far from stable or centralized. Rather, it was a web of shifting alliances, ever-changing power dynamics, and internal conflicts between lords, vassals, and monarchs. Because the power of monarchs was limited by the autonomy of their lords, the political struggle was often won between competing factions of the nobility. The Wars of the Roses in England and the French Wars of Religion. Both conflicts were marked by intense rivalry between noble families, which led to violent battles and political instability. Lords formed alliances with other noble houses, sometimes going to war with former allies, or even turning on their own family members when their ambitions required it. This constant shifting of alliances weakened central authority and caused instability within kingdoms, showing how much power the nobility wielded in the feudal system. Vassals were required to support their lords in times of war, but feudal loyalty could be fragile. The constancy of loyalty among vassals was frequently disrupted by power struggles, particularly when a lord's authority was questioned or when disputes over inheritance arose. The war was fought not only over territory, but also over the question of who had the legitimate claim to the French throne. The English monarchy, through the claim of Edward III, sought to expand its power over France. Here, the lord could hear legal cases, including disputes over land, inheritance, and criminal acts. While the lord had ultimate authority over justice, vassals were responsible for administering local law and maintaining order within their own fief. By organizing and overseeing these courts, lords exerted control over the common folk, ensuring that the laws were followed and that taxes were paid. Lords could also use the courts to expand their land holdings, as disputed or inherited land could be granted to those who won legal cases. Vassals, in turn, might have their own vassals, and were expected to enforce the lord's will in their territories. Whether through diplomacy, war, or marriage, the nobility of medieval Europe constantly shifted alliances and fought to expand or preserve their power. The nobility's ability to wield power through military conquest and the control of land gradually gave way to more monarchical systems of governance. The effects of these transformations would be felt for centuries, ultimately shaping the political and social systems of the modern world. In the next segment, we will explore how the feudal system gave way to the rise of strong monarchies and the centralized states that would define early modern Europe. The feudal justice system reinforced this power structure, with lords administering their own laws and managing the day-to-day operations of their lands. As kings in places like France and England sought to consolidate power, they began to exert more control over local courts and legal systems. As monarchs became stronger and more capable of maintaining law and order, the need for individual lords to dispense justice faded. This ultimately led to the creation of more centralized, standardized legal codes, which paved the way for the formation of modern states. Royal courts replaced many feudal courts, and monarchs passed laws that applied uniformly across the realm, diminishing the authority of local lords. The lord-vassal relationship was one of mutual dependence. Lords needed vassals to manage their lands and keep the peace, while vassals depended on their lords for protection and justice. The manorial court was not a formal legal system, as we would understand it today, but a feudal court in which the lord was both judge and jury. In some regions, the lord would be assisted by other nobles or vassals in making legal decisions, but it was the lord's authority that ultimately determined the outcome. For the French, Joan of Arc became a symbol of resistance, and the war itself ended with France's consolidation of power and the end of English ambitions in France. This war was an example of how conflicts between noble factions and monarchies could evolve from regional squabbles into massive wars of political survival. Lords could find their power undermined not only by external enemies, but also by internal rebellions from those sworn to serve them. Lords were granted not only military power but also legal authority over their territories. They had the right to dispense justice within their domains, a power that gave them significant influence over the lives of those living on their land. Lords could impose taxes, settle disputes, enforce laws, and punish wrongdoers all within the bounds of their fief. The Wars of the Roses were fought between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. When William the Conqueror of Normandy successfully invaded England, he used the power of his army to overthrow King Harold II and establish a new monarchy. William's victory and subsequent rule exemplified how military force could drastically alter the feudal order. His conquest led to the redistribution of land in England, with many Anglo-Saxon nobles replaced by Norman lords, further consolidating the centralized power of the monarchy. For lords' war was a way to gain prestige. strengthen their political position, and extend their territories. Feudal lords regularly fought not only for resources or land, but also to increase their personal influence in the feudal network. A lord's ability to field a strong army and win battles was crucial to maintaining or expanding their power. These two factions, who claimed the English throne, represented competing segments of the nobility. Lords from each faction raised armies to fight for their rights to the crown, and the battles often involved brutal betrayals, shifting alliances, and feudal allegiances that made it difficult for anyone to hold power for long. In this world, the dynastic nature of noble power meant that internal conflicts, whether based on inheritance, land or honor, could turn the political landscape upside down. Here, religion intertwined with the feudal system, as noble families used religious allegiance as a means of consolidating political power. The wars had long-lasting effects, fundamentally altering the political landscape of France, leading to the rise of the Bourbon dynasty and the eventual move toward absolute monarchy. Lords, as the heads of vast territories, were not simply figures of wealth and military prowess. They were also deeply involved in political maneuvering and the delicate art of navigating the feudal system. Feudal Europe was a patchwork of territories governed by different lords, each with their own resources, military forces, and political agendas, the most famous examples of internal conflict among the nobility. Similarly, the French Wars of Religion involved conflict between the Catholic and Huguenot factions, with both sides represented by powerful noble families who vied for control of France. Throughout these conflicts, political strategies such as marriage alliances, feudal oaths of loyalty, and military power were used to advance the interests of noble families. In the world of feudalism, warfare was not merely about gaining territory or defending one. A serelmit was also a tool for political expansion, consolidation of power, and the securing of social order. Feudal loyalty, while grounded in the exchange of land for military service, was often tested by war. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is a prime example of how warfare could reshape the political landscape. The 100 Years' War between England and France was another significant conflict that reshaped medieval Europe. The system of feudal justice played a critical role in maintaining social order and reinforcing the power of lords. The Lord's Court was often the most important institution of governance. The role of vassals in administering justice was equally important. Feudal courts were not simply places to settle disputes. They were key instruments in maintaining the social fabric of the medieval world. Over time, the power dynamics between local lords and kings shifted, and more centralized forms of governance began to emerge. This shift from feudal justice to more centralized royal authority marked the gradual decline of the feudal system and the rise of more modern legal systems. The feudal system created a world where lords and knights had substantial political and military power, but it also resulted in constant political maneuvering and power struggles. However, as time went on, the increasing strength of monarchies and the centralization of authority began to change the dynamics of power in Europe. In medieval feudal society, knights were considered the military elite, occupying a crucial role in both the social hierarchy and the defense of the realm. As vassals to their lords, knights swore an oath of loyalty and fealty, and in exchange for land or wealth, they were expected to serve as the backbone of a lord's military power. The training began in childhood, where boys destined to become knights would start as pages in noble households at the age of 7. As a squire, the young man would train under a knight, often accompanying him into battle, and learning the practical aspects of combat, such as how to wield a sword, ride a horse, and care for weapons and armor. The squire was also responsible for the knight's armor and ensuring that the knight was ready for battle, giving the squire direct exposure to the daily realities of warfare. This code emphasized virtues such as honor, bravery, loyalty, and courtesy. Knights were expected to be valiant in battle, but also to behave with nobility in their interactions with others. Their role as warriors was complemented by their duty to protect those who could not protect themselves, especially women, children, and the poor. Knights were supposed to live by the ideals of self-discipline and integrity, though in practice, these ideals were not always fully realized. The size of the army a lord could muster often depended on the size of his landholdings and the number of vassals and tenants who could be called to fight. The military service that lords owed was formalized through feudal levies, in which the lord agreed to provide military service or a set number of soldiers in exchange for land or protection. During a military campaign, A lord would not only lead his forces but also devise strategies for battle. Lords often relied on their knights for leadership on the front lines, but their decisions on how to deploy troops, when to strike, and when to retreat could have far-reaching consequences. Knights were elite soldiers who formed the backbone of a lord's military might, whereas the lord provided the overarching strategy and organization necessary to conduct campaigns. Military decisions required careful consideration of resources, alliances, and the political context in which the battle occurred. Knights, as elite warriors, represented the martial ideals of chivalry, social and economic landscapes of Europe. The rise of standing armies, the spread of gunpowder technology, and the eventual move toward centralized monarchies all had lasting impacts on the way wars were fought and the nature of military service in the post-feudal world. And loyalty, while lords, as military commanders, had the strategic and political responsibility of managing wars and defending their lands. Through the feudal system, military service was tied directly to land, loyalty, and power, with each participant in the system fulfilling a crucial role. In contrast, lords were expected to command, organize, and finance wars. Lords managed not just the troops but also the resources, often demanding taxes or military service from their vassals to fund wars or build fortifications. The balance between military strength and political strategy in the feudal world was a key factor in determining the success or failure of a lord's reign. Battle formations like the shield wall or cavalry charges were key tactics, and lords often worked closely with experienced knights to execute these plans. This service was usually required for a specific period of time, such as a few weeks or months, and was most often provided during times of war or conflict. They often had engineers and architects who worked to improve defenses, such as adding moats, drawbridges, or watchtowers to their castles to maintain their power and safeguard their lands. This ability to protect one's lands was a significant aspect of a lord's power, as castles were both the home and the fortifications from which they projected authority. This was a formative period, with knights teaching their squires not only the physical skills required for battle, but also the importance of discipline, honor, and leadership. For instance, the Norman conquest of England was driven in part by the military ambitions of William the Conqueror, a powerful lord who used both his resources and his loyal vassals to carry out the invasion of England. This conquest marked a pivotal moment in the consolidation of feudal control in England, as William distributed lands among his loyal vassals, securing his control over the country. Knights were also expected to serve as leaders on the battlefield, organizing and commanding smaller units of soldiers or squires. They were seen as the elite combatants who could turn the tide of a battle with their skill, mounted mobility, and disciplined tactics. In battle, the knights on horseback, clad in heavy armor, were often the shock troops who led the charge against the enemy. During this early stage, they were instructed in the basic skills of nobility. Learning manners, etiquette, the fundamentals of reading their role in society was not only military but also social. Lords were not just landowners and governors. They were also military commanders and required to defend their lands or expand their territories in times of conflict. Their position in the feudal system necessitated that they maintain a well-trained and loyal force, and their military obligations were often closely tied to their status as vassals to more powerful lords, or to the king. They were the idealized embodiment of the medieval warrior, and their conduct in peace, in addition to war, was a reflection of their worth. Their status was not solely defined by their combat abilities, but also by their ability to uphold the moral obligations of their rank, including land stewardship, governance, and managing the lands granted to them by their lord, and writing, and how to serve their lord or master. The role of the knight was not merely to fight in battle, but also to uphold the ideals of chivalry, including honor, loyalty, and courage. Becoming a knight was a process that required years of rigorous training and adherence to a strict code. The knighthood ceremony, often performed in a church, was a deeply symbolic event. The squire would be dubbed a knight through the ceremonial tap of the sword on the shoulder, and he would swear an oath to defend the weak, uphold justice, and serve his lord without question. At the age of 14, the young page would typically transition into the role of a squire. Finally, at the age of 21, the squire could be knighted, assuming he had proven himself in battle or demonstrated exceptional courage and skill. Knights' expectations and code of chivalry. Knights were bound by the code of chivalry, a set of rules that governed their conduct both in battle and in society. The military obligations of a knight went beyond simply fighting in wars. Knights were also seen as symbols of the noble class. While knights were the foot soldiers and elite warriors of the feudal system, lords had significant military responsibilities as well. When a king or higher lord called upon them, lords were expected to raise armies from their own lands, summoning knights, archers, foot soldiers, and serfs to serve in their campaigns. Lords would also engage in raids or military campaigns to expand their lands or to defend their holdings against enemies, whether other lords or foreign invaders. A lord's role as a military commander also extended to battlefield tactics. In addition to warfare, lords also had to fortify their castles, ensuring that they could defend against sieges or surprise attacks. The military role of knights and lords in feudal warfare. Both knights and lords played critical roles in feudal warfare, but their roles were often complementary. While knights were bound by their oaths of service to fight for their lords, there were also independent military agents, using their skills, armor, and mounts to provide powerful, mobile forces on the battlefield. The military roles of knights and lords were central to the structure and success of feudal society. As we continue, we will explore how the feudal military system evolved and how warfare during the Middle Ages shaped not only the power dynamics of the time, but also the long-term consequences on the political. After delving into the intricate roles of feudal lords and ladies in medieval society, it becomes evident that the feudal system was more than just a political structure. It was a way of life that intertwined duty, loyalty, and honor with both the cultural fabric and the military endeavors of the time. These values were deeply enmeshed in the lives of the nobility, but they also extended far beyond them, impacting the common folk who were often caught up in the power struggles of their lords. While the feudal system itself may have crumbled, its cultural legacy continues to captivate our imagination, influencing everything from modern storytelling to how we define ideals of leadership and personal sacrifice. In the next segment, we will explore the myths and legends surrounding medieval chivalry and how these ideals were passed down through the centuries to remain an integral part of modern consciousness. The lives of the noble classes, while marked by certain privileges, were fraught with challenges, from internal rivalries between families to the ever-present threats of invasions or rebellions. The balance between loyalty and power was delicate, and the consequences of these struggles were felt across the political and military landscape of medieval Europe. As we move forward, our next focus will shift to the cultural significance of feudal warfare, exploring how the ideals of chivalry and warrior culture became much more than practical concepts. They became legendary symbols that shaped how later generations viewed heroism, leadership, and sacrifice. From epic tales of knights in shining armor to the romanticized depictions of medieval battles, these values of courage, loyalty, and nobility evolved into the stuff of myth and legend. Through the lens of literature, film, and popular culture, we continue to see the enduring appeal of medieval knights, epic battles, and kingship.